Hey guys, tonight we crawl back to a time before refrigerators, microwaves, or even forks was still not there. You're barefoot on a dirt floor, the air thick with wood smoke and onions, and your dinner? It's been simmering in the same pot for days. Welcome to a medieval kitchen where the stew is eternal and the choices are few. And just a heads up, you probably won't survive this century without a strong stomach and very low expectations. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is. I'm always curious who's drifting off with us from halfway around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge into a dim one-room cottage, ducking through a low wooden door that barely clears your forehead. Your clothes itch. Everything itches, really. The air smells like damp straw, boiled root vegetables, and smoke from a fire that's been going all day, and probably most of the week. The hearth isn't just for warmth. It's your kitchen, your stove, your heating system, and sometimes your bug repellent, all rolled into one. In the center of it all, a battered iron pot hangs over flickering coals. Its contents, a thick bubbling pottage, equal parts lentils, barley, yesterday's cabbage, a suspicious bone, and maybe a turnip or two. You're not entirely sure what went into it at this point. Nobody is. That's the beauty and the horror of perpetual stew. You just keep adding ingredients and letting it go. No refrigeration, no problem. Just keep it hot enough to deter bacteria and hope for the best. This was survival food. Not glamorous, but filling. Sometimes tasty, mostly edible. Historians still argue whether this kind of open hearth stew actually lasted for weeks, or if that's just one of those legends that got exaggerated over time. Either way, it's been bubbling long enough that the spoon stands up on its own. You sit down at a heavy wooden table that looks like it might have once been part of a fence. There's no silverware, just a knife at your belt and your own fingers, maybe a communal spoon, if you're lucky and not squeamish. The bread is yesterday's, and the day before that's too. Hard, dark, and dense as a brick. It's perfect for dunking, because otherwise you might chip a tooth. The family goat bleats from the corner, tied up just far enough not to nibble your sleeve. It's a useful beast. Milk, maybe the occasional nibble of meat if times get desperate, and honestly, just a weird form of companionship. Outside, chickens peck through the yard like little prehistoric scavengers. You'll be eating their eggs if they're laying. If not, well, boiled chicken feet make a surprisingly chewy treat. Here's your first mainstream historical fact for the night. Most medieval homes didn't have a separate kitchen. The fire was smack dab in the living space. Efficient, sure, but your lungs paid the price. In wealthier homes, separate kitchens became more common to prevent fires from spreading and to keep the heat out of the main halls. But for peasants, the stew pot lived where you did. Oh, and that quirky little tidbit we promised? Some medieval families hung herbs and dried fish from the ceiling beams, not just for storage, but to keep bad spirits away. Also to flavor the air, which was fair game because nothing else in here smells fresh. As the pottage continues to bubble, you rip off a chunk of that hardened bread and dunk it deep into the brown slurry. It's surprisingly tasty. The flavors have had time to meld into something complex. Smoky, earthy, deeply umami if you want to be generous about it. But just as you take a second bite, someone leans over and says, "Careful, that part's from last week." You pause, mid-chew. Is that a joke? Unclear. Sometimes, if the family had something to spare, maybe a few wild leeks, a sliver of bacon, a forgotten carrot, they'd throw it in, not out of culinary flair, but pure necessity. Food waste was not a thing. Anything remotely edible went into the pot. And if you were lucky enough to have meat, it was a rare occasion. More often than not, the meaty flavor came from bones boiled into submission or scraps scavenged from better times. And here comes your first reality check joke of the night. You're living on soup, root vegetables, and mystery gristle, but at least there's no keto diet to pretend you're doing this for fun. The fireplace crackles. A child stirs the pot with a stick that might also double as a walking cane. You sip a ladleful and feel it warm your belly. There's no exact recipe. Every household has its own take, depending on what's growing, what's dying, and what didn't spoil. That constant boiling? It was their version of just in case. But don't mistake this for lazy cooking. This was a full-time job. Starting the fire alone could take half the morning if the weather was damp. You couldn't just pop something in the oven because ovens were rare and wood was precious. Every hot meal meant someone sweated over the fire, stirred the pot, adjusted the smoke vent, and tried not to singe their eyebrows off. As you lean back, full in the way that only barley-heavy stew can make you, you glance around the tiny home. This is food as function, every calorie earned, every bite with a backstory. You don't eat for pleasure, you eat because otherwise you're one rainstorm away from fainting in the field. Outside, twilight settles. A neighbor knocks. He's here to borrow a pinch of salt and maybe a splash of broth. You nod. The stew is community property after all. Everyone gives a little, everyone takes a little. And the pot never, ever stops. You wake up with the sun beaming rudely through the cracks in the wooden shutters, and your throat feels like you've been licking parchment all night. You're parched. But don't even think about heading outside to scoop a mug of water from the stream. Not unless you're actively looking to develop a personal relationship with dysentery. You need a drink, but this is medieval Europe, and clean water is as mythical as dragons. Less fiery, but just as dangerous. So what's on the menu? Ale. For breakfast, yes, really. You reach for the ceramic mug by the hearth and take a cautious sip. It's warmish, slightly fizzy, and tastes like sour bread with a hoppy attitude. This is what they called small beer, low in alcohol, high in hydration, and as close to safe drinking water as most folks ever got. Historians still argue whether everyone, including children, actually drank beer all day, or if that's a modern exaggeration. But we know this. Small beer was safer than the water, and provided just enough alcohol to kill off some nasties without sending you staggering into the nearest goose pen. People brewed it at home, sometimes daily, using leftover grains and whatever yeasty magic floated in from the air. It wasn't glamorous, but it did the job. You're not tipsy. You're lightly preserved. Now, don't get too excited. It's not Oktoberfest. The alcohol content was often lower than 1%, barely enough to make you blink. But it was filling, and it kept your innards from revolting. You can almost hear a medieval doctor whispering, "Trust me, it's beer or the plague." And if you're a child, you're getting a mug too. There's no juice box waiting for you. No milk unless the cow just happened to be in a good mood. Even monks who swore off most indulgences brewed their own versions of beer as a liquid food during fasting periods. Clever loophole, honestly. But it wasn't all beer and cheer. Brewing could be risky. If your batch went bad, it could sour, grow mold, or flat out poison you. Medieval brewing knowledge was part tradition, part superstition. You'd stir the pot clockwise for good luck, cover it with herbs to ward off evil spirits, and pray your yeast didn't go rogue. Quirky fact of the day, some brewers tied cats to the rafters above their brewing vats, not to ward off mice, but as a weird charm for fermentation success. Brew with blessings, apparently. You lean against the wooden door frame with your mug in hand, watching a few neighbors haul buckets from the nearby well. It's supposed to be safe, protected with a wooden cover, and blessed by the village priest every spring. But even then, you're playing stomach roulette. Wells were easily contaminated by livestock, runoff, and the occasional unlucky frog. Filtering water wasn't really a thing. Boiling it was too much of a firewood expense for daily use. So, yes, you drink beer with breakfast. Everyone does. And while some wealthier folks had wine, that was a luxury, a gift from the vineyards of southern Europe, transported by barrel and taxed by the sep. In the colder north, wine was rarer, pricier, and usually diluted anyway. Real talk? It didn't taste great unless you were royalty. For the rest of us, if you wanted something fancy, you'd spice your ale with herbs, or throw in a handful of dried fruit for flair. You head back inside where the morning meal is as humble as ever. Maybe a chunk of yesterday's bread and a bit of soft cheese if the goats have been productive. No eggs. Those go to market, fetch more coin than you'd think. But you've got beer, and honestly, that's what's going to keep you standing through your morning chores. The idea of drinking with breakfast might seem strange to you now, but remember, modern refrigeration, sanitation, and Brita filters weren't even concepts. You either adapted or expired. You take another sip and feel the yeast work its quiet magic. It fills you up just enough, gives you a slight energy boost, and maybe dulls that aching shoulder from hauling firewood. It's breakfast as medication, except, it tastes like old granola in bathwater. By midday, you might switch to a stronger brew, maybe even cider if the apples were good that year. Villages with access to orchards made use of every part of the fruit. They even fermented the peels and cores into weaker batches for children or the elderly. A kind of medieval juice cleanse, only more honest about its alcohol content. In some towns, ale production became a neighborhood business. Women, called ale wives, were the backbone of local brewing, turning grains into profit and nourishment. You'd know who brewed best by the ale stake hanging above their door. A bushy bundle of twigs or a pole with a symbol inviting thirsty travelers to stop by. These women were respected, essential, and occasionally accused of witchcraft if the brew was too good or business too booming. Can't win them all. Of course, you didn't drink all day long. Well, some people did, but most just sipped regularly. The idea wasn't intoxication, it was survival and hydration. Because, spoiler alert, medieval people still got thirsty, and without the modern blessings of water purification, they had to get creative. You swish the last of the ale in your cup and let it slide down your throat. There's a faint aftertaste of wood smoke and grain husk. Not bad, not great, but definitely safer than whatever's floating in the village pond right now. So while modern folks get fancy with cold brews and oat milk lattes, you're here with your morning mug of beer and a new appreciation for yeast. Life without refrigeration didn't mean thirst, just that quenching it came with bubbles and a very mild buzz. You're knee-deep in mud by mid-morning, cursing softly as your boot gets sucked into the squelch of an early autumn field. Welcome to the source of your next meal, the medieval garden, or as you might call it, your very survival patch. Forget supermarkets or food delivery. If it doesn't grow here or wander through here, it doesn't end up on your plate. The garden behind your cottage is small but mighty. You eye the raised beds with their uneven rows of cabbages, leeks, onions, and parsnips. They're not planted for beauty, no cute chalkboard signs or artistic tomato cages. This is utility at its scrappiest. But make no mistake, these humble vegetables are your year-round lifeline. Leeks, with their tough green stalks and oniony swagger, are a favorite. They pop up in every dish, from stews to pies, and they hold up even after a few cold snaps. Cabbage? Oh, it's everywhere. Boiled, fried, if you're rich in lard, or even pickled into something that definitely isn't sauerkraut but smells like a science experiment gone right. Parsnips, carrots, the purple ones, not the orange kind, turnips, they all fill in the culinary blanks. Root vegetables were the real MVPs before refrigeration, surviving in root cellars or buried right in the ground, snug under straw, until you needed them. Mainstream historical fact time. Medieval gardens were not just for food, they were medicinal too. A patch of sage, some rue, maybe a bit of wormwood in the back. Your food and your pharmacy shared space, often tended by the same dirty, capable hands. The line between dinner and remedy was thin. Got a sore throat? That same onion you're chopping for stew might end up mashed into a poultice. But here's the quirky twist. One of the most treasured vegetables wasn't even a vegetable. It was the good old garden snail. That's right. People farmed snails. Some monasteries even kept snail pens, high in protein, easy to feed, and technically not meat. According to some monastic rules, snails were a surprisingly popular food, especially during Lent, when meat was off limits. You'd toss them in with garlic and herbs, maybe a splash of oil if you had it, and boom, medieval escargot. Fancy. You pull a few late-season leeks from the soil, wipe your hands on your tunic, and trudge back toward the house. On your way, you pass the compost pile, except no one called it that. It's just the place where inedible scraps, eggshells, and unfortunate turnips go to die, and later reborn as rich soil. Waste nothing, remember? Back inside, you get to work chopping. The fire's been restarted, the pottage still bubbling like a muddy cauldron. You add the leeks and whatever herbs haven't gone brittle. The kitchen smells sharp and earthy. There's no fridge, no freezer, not even a pantry in the way you'd understand. Just shelves, crocks, and hanging bundles. Storing food without refrigeration was more than an inconvenience. It was a science, wrapped in superstition. Vegetables were stored in pits, buried beneath layers of straw and soil to keep them cold and protected from frost. Apples, wrapped in straw and stored in barrels, and onions, garlic, and herbs, hung from the rafters like culinary wind chimes. In some areas, people even used snow-packed pits, primitive ice boxes, to chill perishable items for a few extra weeks. But that required access to ice, and ice was a luxury not everyone could afford to harvest or keep, so root cellars were king. Dug into the earth, they stayed naturally cool year-round and could keep potatoes or apples viable for months if you kept the rats out. Historians still argue whether the average peasant had a real cellar or just buried a few vegetables near the back door. Wealthier families built full subterranean larders, sometimes 2 or 3 rooms deep, where stone walls and airflow helped extend the life of everything from cheese to salted meats. If you were really fancy, you had a cool room with airflow chutes designed to channel breeze. Medieval HVAC, in a way. You sip your lukewarm ale and glance at the rafters. A few strings of garlic and some drying herbs sway gently in the draft. There's something strangely beautiful about it. This ceiling holds your winter seasoning, your flu remedies, and your last defense against flavorless stew. At the corner of the room, a wide ceramic jar covered in wax cloth sits quietly. It's full of pickled vegetables, mostly cabbage, onion, and maybe a rogue carrot slice. Pickling was a major preservation method. People soaked food in vinegar, wine, or brine, sometimes adding spices like mustard seed or dill. The tangy scent hits your nose as you lift the cloth, pungent, potent, and oddly mouth-watering. It's like medieval kimchi, minus the chili flakes. Fermentation, by the way, was everywhere. Not because they were trendy health freaks with kombucha kits, but because it worked. Bread, beer, pickles, cheese, they all relied on fermentation to make food last longer, taste better, and possibly develop magical bacteria that prevented scurvy. Maybe. The jury's still out on that. And here's your third laugh for the night. If your food looked, smelled, or tasted off, you didn't throw it away. You added spices and hoped for the best. Medieval cooks were masters of disguise. A little vinegar, a pinch of sage, maybe a spoonful of mustard, and voila, yesterday's borderline cabbage became tangy greens. As the afternoon light shifts across the hearthstone floor, you stir the pot again. Each bubble brings a new scent, a hint of garden freshness hiding under layers of smoke and thyme. There's no clock on the wall. You cook until it's ready, or until someone's stomach growls loud enough to declare mealtime. You might not have a fridge humming in the corner or plastic bins full of baby carrots, but you've got something sturdier, a living pantry, one that grows outside your door, hangs from your ceiling, and bubbles in your pot. And really, what more could you ask for? Well, maybe a goat that doesn't eat your last onion. You slump onto the creaky bench, legs coated in dried dirt, stomach just beginning to whisper its first complaints. You know what's coming next. Pottage. Again. And if you're expecting something revolutionary, like noodles or chicken nuggets, sit down gently. This is about to get medieval. Pottage is not a dish. It's a concept, a culinary state of being. Basically, it's a stew, but not in the rich, chunky way you might imagine. It's more like vegetable porridge that's been simmering so long, it's developed a personality and maybe a grudge. You just keep adding to it day after day and hope it doesn't notice. At the center of your cottage, the pot hangs over a low flame. It hasn't been emptied in weeks. This is perpetual stew, also known, jokingly, as forever soup. Every day, you throw in yesterday's leftovers, a few new vegetables, maybe some herbs or a splash of ale. If someone managed to catch a rabbit, pigeon, or even a hedgehog, they did eat those, spiny but edible. You'd toss in the meat, bones, and all. And yes, that is absolutely a thing. In parts of Europe, baked hedgehog was a real rural delicacy, usually wrapped in clay to remove the quills. You grab a wooden ladle and give it a stir. The bottom is thick, congealed, and vaguely threatening. The top is fresher, green flecks from the wild sorrel you picked yesterday, and a few strands of something fibrous, possibly leek or possibly linen. Hard to say. There's a good smell wafting up, though, savory, earthy, a little smoky from the wood fire. Mainstream historical fact alert. Pottage was the staple of the medieval diet, especially for peasants. Meat was rare, so the dish had to rely on grains, legumes, and vegetables. Lentils, peas, barley, and oats were common thickeners, making the stew heavy enough to actually fill your stomach, which was important when you burned 3,000 calories a day just staying alive. And yes, you're eating it again. Because it's cheap, it stretches for days and it doesn't spoil quickly. Without refrigeration, the trick is to keep the pot hot for as long as possible, often left hanging over warm embers or briefly reheated each morning. As long as it kept bubbling, it stayed safe-ish to eat. Historians still argue whether the pot was truly never cleaned, or if that's an over-romanticized myth. But the idea of ongoing stews is well documented. Some towns even had community cauldrons where families took turns contributing ingredients. You drop in a carrot, fish out dinner, and carry on. Communal cooking before the potluck went corporate. You slurp the thick broth from your wooden bowl, and it's edible. Not good, not bad. Just there. Comfort food for people who don't have time to be comfortable. Every bite is a gamble. Sometimes you hit a chunk of carrot, sometimes a bone shard from yesterday's mystery bird. Still, it's not without charm. The longer it cooks, the more the flavors deepen, forming a strange medieval umami that actually makes you crave the next spoonful. Plus, it's warm, which is half the battle when you're wrapped in layers and still shivering. Let's not forget the grains. Your pottage has a handful of barley tonight. Last week, it was cracked rye, and every so often you get the surprise addition of millet, an ancient cereal grain that's making a hipster comeback now, but back then, it was survival food. Oh, and don't get the idea that you're seasoning with salt like a modern chef. Salt was expensive, especially inland. If you had some, it was used sparingly, maybe rubbed into meat or used to brine a few pickles. Instead, you relied on strong herbs. Sage, thyme, garlic, mustard seed, or whatever was growing wild and hadn't been peed on by goats. Speaking of wild things, have you foraged lately? Because in a world without refrigeration, knowing your weeds could save your life. Nettles, dandelion greens, ramsons, a wild garlic with a punch, these were all tossed into the stew pot when your garden couldn't keep up. Some even believed nettle helped warm the blood, which sounds fake, but also sounds exactly like something a medieval herbalist would shout while throwing it in by the fistful. And here's the fun fringe fact. Some folks added animal blood to the stew as a protein boost. Yep, blood pudding wasn't just for sausages. When meat was scarce, farmers sometimes let a little blood from a pig or cow and used it in cooking. You'd whisk it in with vinegar to keep it from clotting. Think of it as the original iron supplement, if you can stomach it. Tonight, though, there's no blood in your pottage, just some root vegetables, a hint of dried apple, and possibly a rogue pigeon leg. You chew thoughtfully and try not to remember the last time you cleaned the pot, or if you ever did. Around you, others eat with quiet appreciation, not joy exactly, but sustenance. You scrape your bowl clean and offer a low, satisfied grunt that translates to, "Not bad, actually." Someone else nods, lifting their bowl for seconds. The pottage continues to evolve. One pot, infinite dinners. You could almost believe it's magic, except it tastes more like patience and onions. When the bowl is empty, you place it near the fire to dry. No washing, not really. Just a wipe with a crust of bread or a cloth that's been rinsed in the stream. May the bacteria gods be merciful. You check the stew one last time, give it a stir, and top it off with a splash of water and a few fresh scraps for tomorrow. And just like that, dinner is ready for the next day again. You wake to the rattle of wind outside and the distant bark of a dog that may or may not be real. It's hard to tell in this half-lit morning fog. What's definitely real is the sharp sting of hunger in your belly. Breakfast time. And no, there's no cold cereal, no scrambled eggs with avocado toast, and definitely no drive-through latte. You, my medieval friend, are headed straight for a trench of bread and a splash of ale. Let's talk about bread, your eternal, ever-present companion. Thick, heavy, coarse, and usually stale enough to qualify as a building material. You don't eat it fresh unless you're rich or dangerously lucky. The rest of the time it's yesterday's loaf, softened in broth, ale, or goat's milk if you're feeling indulgent. Bread wasn't just a side. It was the plate, the utensil, the napkin, and sometimes, depressingly, the entire meal. You grab your portion, a chunk torn from a dark, crusty loaf. This is Maslin bread, made from a mix of rye and barley, maybe a pinch of wheat if the harvest was good. Spoiler, it probably wasn't. White bread existed, but unless you owned land or wore rings, you weren't getting any. White flour required extra sifting and processing, so it became a status symbol. Poor folks like you got brown, coarse, fibrous loaves that could survive a drop from a window and still be edible. Mainstream historical fact, bread was so central to the medieval diet that bakers were among the most regulated trades in town. In England, for example, there was the assize of bread and ale, a law dating back to the 13th century, which fixed the size and price of loaves according to the cost of grain. If a baker cheated on the weight, they could be fined or even publicly punished. So yes, your loaf came with a little government oversight, even back then. This particular morning, the bread is extra chewy. You suspect it's been recycled from the previous week's batch and is now approaching weapon status. Still, you tear into it, dipping it into a small bowl of ale. That's right, ale. Not because you're trying to get tipsy before sunrise, but because water is risky. Most streams and wells are a bit suspect, so ale becomes the safer everyday drink. It's low in alcohol, barely fermented, and often called small beer. Even kids drink it. Breakfast of champions and a little bubbly if you're lucky. You sip the ale, it's flat, sour, and just a little grainy. Still, it washes the bread down, and it's cold, which is something. Next to you, someone gnaws on a piece of trencher bread, yesterday's plate, made from a dense slab used to soak up meat drippings at the last meal. Once it's saturated, it becomes edible, or at the very least, chewable. In some cases, the trenchers weren't even eaten by the diner. They were collected afterward and given to the poor or fed to animals. Sustainable dining at its weirdest. Now, here comes the quirky twist. Some breads weren't made of grain at all. During times of famine, people got creative and desperate. There are records of famine bread made from acorns, pea flour, tree bark, yes, actual bark, and even ground-up ferns. These substitutes were hard to digest, low in nutrients, and could cause stomach cramps. But hey, it was better than eating your boots. Barely. You glance toward the hearth where someone is preparing a morning mush, a warm grain porridge made of oats or millet, boiled with water or milk, if any, could be spared. It's bland, but it warms your core and doesn't chip your teeth like the bread might. Sometimes dried fruits or honey were added, but more often it was just plain and sludgy. Still, it fills you up, and that's the goal. You spoon a bit into your mouth. It's hot, gooey, and surprisingly comforting. You notice the edges are crusting where it touched the pot. Those burnt bits are a treat, crunchy and slightly nutty. You savor them slowly, pretending it's something more exciting. Historians still argue whether breakfast was a regular meal for medieval peasants or something taken only when there was extra food around. Some sources suggest a two-meal structure, one around midday and one in the evening. Others argue that laborers and field workers absolutely needed a morning bite before work, even if it was just bread and ale. You're firmly in the please feed me now camp. Now, a little fringe tidbit to spice things up. In some monasteries, the first meal of the day was delayed until late morning, part of spiritual discipline. Monks might start their day with several hours of prayer before eating a single morsel. Meanwhile, you're praying your porridge doesn't get stolen while you're not looking. As breakfast winds down, you tuck the last corner of bread into your cloak pocket for later. It's stiff and dry, but it might make a decent snack if you're lucky, or bait for a mousetrap if you're not. The rest of the cottage is stirring. Someone is sharpening a blade. Another wraps their feet in wool strips before heading out into the fields. You rinse your bowl. Again, rinse here means wiping it with a hunk of stale bread, and glance outside. The sky's already gone from gray to brighter gray, and there's work to do. But at least you've had your morning carbs. The life of a medieval peasant might lack luxuries, but it never lacks bread. You eat it, sleep near it, and sometimes even use it as a dish. You joke about it breaking your teeth, but secretly, you're grateful. Without it, your belly would be as empty as your water barrel after market day. With a full-ish stomach and slightly wobbly legs from the morning ale, you step outside to greet the day. The wind smells like smoke and damp wool. Your breath fogs as you walk toward your chores, humming a little tune about the one true constant in your life: bread. You're ankle-deep in mud, trailing behind a plodding ox that smells like wet rug and old socks. It's barely mid-morning, and your muscles already feel like soup. The bread and ale breakfast has worn off, leaving your stomach hinting at another round. But lunchtime isn't a thing you schedule. It's a thing that sneaks up on you somewhere between aching and ravenous. Your world right now revolves around seasonal food. What's growing, what's dying, and what you manage to preserve in time to outlast the current hunger wave. In a medieval society without refrigeration, time is everything. You don't eat by preference, you eat by availability. Welcome to the great revolving door of medieval cuisine. Spring peas one month, shriveled turnips the next. You squat beside a row of withering cabbages, giving one a half-hearted tug. It's soft on one side. Not ideal. Still edible, probably. This is the challenge. Fresh food is a brief luxury. Once it's harvested, the clock starts ticking. Rot sets in fast without cold storage. So people relied on a dizzying combination of drying, salting, fermenting, pickling, and root cellaring just to make it through the dead months. Mainstream historical fact: medieval diets were deeply seasonal. Without the luxury of imports or refrigerated transport, communities ate what they grew when it grew. That's why feast days often aligned with harvests or slaughter periods. Celebrating wasn't just tradition, it was biology. Your body needed the calories. You wipe your hands and glance over the modest kitchen garden. It's no Versailles, but it's your lifeline. Right now, you've got kale, leeks, onions, and the ever-present turnip. The cabbage is fading, and the carrots are starting to twist and split. But this humble plot has to keep you alive through the season. You don't grow for taste, you grow for survival. And when fresh produce runs low, you turn to what you've stashed. In the cottage, the rafters are strung with drying herbs and garlands of onions and garlic, all slowly turning into lightweight, crispy versions of their former selves. Dried legumes, peas, lentils, beans, are stored in ceramic pots, sealed with wax or fat, to keep the bugs out. There are even a few precious apples nestled in straw in the coolest corner, slowly softening like edible time bombs. You return to the house for a midday meal. It's another pot of pottage, this time chunkier. Someone found some beans and a suspiciously wrinkled parsnip. But there's also a treat, pickles, not the vinegary, deli-style ones you might be used to. These are lacto-fermented vegetables, preserved in brine, allowed to bubble and sour in their own microbial party until tangy and shelf-stable. You crunch into a pickled carrot. It's sharp, salty, and vaguely fizzy. You love it. A rare flavor punch in a bland landscape. Your neighbor gags slightly. He's not a pickle fan, but you shoot him a smug glance. More for you. In some areas, especially in Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, people fermented fish, like buried it in the ground and weighted fish. It developed a strong ammonia scent and a taste that grew on you if you were lucky, or knocked you out if you weren't. You haven't tried it yet. You're okay with that. The big preservation work, though, happens around harvest and slaughter season. That's when salt becomes your most powerful tool. You rub it into meat, pack it into barrels with fish, and even use it to preserve vegetables like beans or leafy greens. It draws out moisture, stifles bacteria, and buys you precious time. Historians still argue whether all these techniques were equally common across peasant households, or if salt preserving was mostly a monastic or merchant-level resource. Some believe rural folks leaned harder on drying and fermenting because salt was expensive and tightly regulated. You've only seen a proper salt barrel once, and you were very nearly yelled at for licking your finger after touching it. Speaking of meat, don't get excited. Fresh meat is rare, but preserved meat, especially bacon or salted fish, is a different story. Fish was heavily eaten during Lent and fasting days, and preservation meant even inland folks could get their share, albeit in chewy, briny form. If you were lucky enough to kill a pig, every scrap was used. Blood became pudding, intestines became sausage casings, and the meat was either smoked, salted, or cooked, and stored in fat as confit. Yes, medieval people accidentally invented the world's most rustic Tupperware. You eye a ceramic jar near the fire. Inside is a lump of goose meat submerged in a layer of hardened goose fat. It smells rich, slightly funky, and deeply satisfying. You scoop out a bit and smear it on a crust of bread. Instant energy, preserved from weeks ago. Your body practically sings. Out back, a rudimentary root cellar helps store other treasures. It's a dug-out pit lined with straw and wood, where root vegetables, apples, and even cheese can rest in the cooler earth. The temperature isn't cold enough for modern refrigeration, but it's a step above a sunlit shelf. You lower a basket down, checking on your hoard. One apple has caved in on itself. The others look bruised but salvageable. The cheese is moldy on the outside, but that's normal, probably. Here's another fun twist. People preserved eggs by submerging them in lime water or packing them in ash. If you did it right, you could eat an egg that was several months old without dying. Probably. You make a mental note to do this next time your hen lays more than 3 in 1 week. As evening comes, you roast a turnip near the fire and dream about summer strawberries and autumn apples. The rhythm of food in your world is constant and unforgiving, but weirdly poetic. You don't crave mangoes in January because you've never even heard of mangoes. You crave the first green shoot, the first berry, the first juicy plum. Each one is a reward for surviving. You take a bite of your roasted turnip. It's sweet, nutty, and faintly smoky. You smile. 1 season down, a dozen more to go. The moon is still up when you roll out of bed. If you can call a sack of straw and a questionable wool blanket a bed, there's frost on the edge of the window ledge, and your breath fogs the air as you pull on a tunic that smells like smoke, sweat, and something vaguely like soup. Today is no ordinary day. Today is market day. Your pouch holds a few coins, precious, irregular things that jangle like you're trying to summon every thief within earshot. But most trade won't be done with metal. No. Today, you'll barter. Because in the medieval world, the market wasn't just for buying. It was where you swapped, begged, haggled, and maybe got scammed with a bag of mystery flour. The road is rough underfoot, and your donkey is in a particularly grumpy mood, which means you're doing most of the walking. As you crest the hill, the town unfurls before you like a spilled basket of bricks and timber. Smoke curls from chimneys. Bells toll in the distance. And the smell, oh, the smell, hits you with a wall of fish guts, manure, bread, and sweat. Welcome to the beating heart of commerce. Mainstream historical fact. Medieval markets were the primary centers of trade and social exchange, especially for rural communities. Towns were granted market rights by the king or lord, and these events could range from weekly markets to massive annual fairs. They weren't just about buying things. You went to hear news, see strangers, and maybe witness a public execution if it was that kind of day. You shuffle between stalls, eyes scanning the goods. There are onions braided like necklaces, smoked eels coiled like shoelaces, and slabs of salted pork stacked like books. Some are fresh, some less so. One man hawks meat pies with suspicious steam rising from them. Another offers apple wine, which smells more like fermented foot. This is your chance to pick up ingredients you can't grow or store easily, like spices. You eye a small cloth pouch on a merchant's table. Inside, peppercorns. They're rare and expensive, often worth more than gold by weight. You can't afford them. But you might afford mustard seeds, which, ground with vinegar, can turn even the blandest pottage into something resembling flavor. You trade 2 turnips, a half-wheel of hard cheese, and your least favorite spoon for a pouch of mustard seeds and a handful of dried juniper berries. The merchant also tries to sell you something called wormwood cordial. You pass, barely. Now for your favorite part, sampling. You nibble a bit of smoked herring, chew a corner off a date that's almost entirely sugar crystal by now, and marvel at a fig that someone swears came from the Holy Land. It tastes mostly of dust and ambition. Still, it's exotic, and for a moment, you feel like a world traveler. Some medieval markets included fake food sellers, people who'd soak wood in broth and sell it as meat or dye sawdust to resemble spices. There's even a recorded case of someone selling pigeon carcasses as young swan, culinary catfishing medieval style. Historians still argue whether most peasants regularly visited markets or relied entirely on local barter. Some scholars say market trips were rare, special occasions, more for selling goods than stocking up. Others point to archaeological finds like foreign pottery or non-native grains as evidence that even rural folks occasionally dip their toes into the economic waters. You lean toward the latter because here you are, eyeing a stall full of strange, enticing goods, dried oranges, garum sauce, Roman fish goop that's somehow still trendy, saffron in thread-like wisps, and pickled walnuts. It's all far above your station, but looking is free, and dreaming even freer. You overhear someone discussing almond milk, which surprises you. You thought that was a modern hipster thing. Turns out it was actually quite popular in the Middle Ages, especially during Lent, or fasting days when animal products were forbidden. Ground almonds mixed with water made a rich, creamy liquid that doubled as cooking fat and drink. Who knew? With your purchases tied to your belt and your donkey only slightly more irritated than earlier, you make your way toward the outer edge of the market, where the food stalls are louder and rowdier. Here, cooks toss sizzling pieces of meat on griddles, boil honey into candies, and roast apples with cloves. You buy a hot pie filled with some sort of spiced meat. It could be pork or rat or yesterday's goat. You don't care. It's warm and delicious. You find a spot on a stone bench, feet aching and face flushed. Around you, people shout over prices. Kids steal bites of food and vanish like ghosts. And a monk argues with a merchant over the moral quality of cheese with worms. That cheese, by the way, is real. Called casu marzu in some regions, It's a soft cheese deliberately infested with maggots that help break it down into a creamy, strong-flavored paste, not for the squeamish or the living, if we're being honest. As the sun dips lower, the market starts to close. You grab a few last things, a cured sausage, a bag of coarse salt, and a scrap of paper with someone's dubious plum wine recipe, and prepare for the trek home. The donkey, miraculously, is now in a better mood. Maybe it's the sausage smell. You leave the bustling noise behind and return to the quiet countryside, stomach fuller and satchel heavier. It's amazing what a trip to the market can yield. Not just food, but stories, ideas, and a sense that your little hamlet isn't quite so isolated after all. And sure, maybe you were overcharged for that sausage, and maybe the mustard seeds have a few pebbles mixed in, but you wouldn't trade this day for anything, not even fresh mangoes. Probably. You're elbow deep in a wooden basin, swirling a fistful of flour and water when your neighbor pokes his head through the doorway with a dramatic sniff. "Is that real bread I smell?" he asks, eyes gleaming. You nod proudly, though the dough still looks more like glue than something edible. Still, in your world, even glue bread is a luxury. Because baking, my friend, is no small feat. In a medieval kitchen, making bread without refrigeration, pre-milled flour, or even your own oven is a full-blown event. It starts with the grain, and that's where your real trouble begins. Most likely, your bread is made from rye or barley, wheat, if you're one of the lucky ones, or the nobility. Rye grows well in poor soil and colder climates, but it comes with a risk: ergot. That's a toxic fungus that can cause hallucinations, convulsions, or, as some folks say, dancing madness. Historians still argue whether ergot poisoning played a role in historical panics like the Salem witch trials, or the medieval outbreaks of dancing plagues. You can't be sure, but your neighbor did try to marry a tree last summer, so mainstream fact. Bread was the medieval dietary cornerstone, and nearly everyone consumed it daily. But bread covered a wide range of quality. White bread made from sifted wheat flour was reserved for the rich and religious institutions. You're eating something closer to a grayish brick that might double as a blunt weapon. Flour doesn't just appear in sacks, either. After harvest, you dry the grain and bring it to the mill if your lord allows it. Most peasants are legally bound to the manor's mill, and they have to pay a grinding fee, usually in the form of grain. That's right, you bring 5 sacks of barley and get 4 and a scolding. Still, you return home with enough ground meal to make your daily loaf. Your kitchen doesn't have a temperature-controlled proving drawer or even a thermostat. Instead, you rely on instinct, weather, and luck. Your starter, or barm, is borrowed from yesterday's brew, the frothy, yeast-rich foam skimmed-off ale. Or you might use a bit of old dough that's gone pleasantly sour. That's your leavening agent. Welcome to the wild, unpredictable world of sourdough. The dough rises slowly in a bowl tucked near the fire. You watch it like a hawk. Too much heat, and it dies. Too little, and it never grows. You lightly cover it with a damp cloth, mutter a brief prayer to Saint Honoratus, patron saint of bakers, and go fetch firewood. Now, baking. That's tricky. Most peasants don't own ovens. They're expensive, they require massive amounts of fuel, and you don't want your entire cottage doubling as a brick furnace. So, many people bring their shaped loaves to a communal oven, often run by the manor or the church. You queue, you gossip, and you pay your oven fee, sometimes with a share of your precious bread. Others bake in a clamp or on a griddle, makeshift methods that involve heating stones, layering embers, and hoping your bread doesn't turn into coal. You try one of those today. The flat bread you pull from the stones is blackened around the edges but steaming and soft inside. You tear off a piece. It's sour, dense, and earthy. You love it. Quirky tidbit? Some households baked trencher bread, huge, stale loaves used as edible plates. After the meal, The gravy-soaked trenchers were either eaten by servants, donated to the poor, or fed to animals. So yes, your plate might have been lunch number 2 for someone else. You serve your bread with what you have. Soft cheese, a smear of lard, maybe an onion. Your teeth wrestle the crust, and crumbs scatter across the table like tiny edible rocks. It's satisfying in a way store-bought fluff could never match. But bread is also a social marker. White bread, made from fine wheat flour, signals wealth and refinement. Brown bread, coarse, fibrous, maybe with bits of grit from a poorly cleaned millstone, is for you. You're the brown bread brigade, and you're fine with it mostly. On special occasions, you might sweeten your dough with honey or spice it with caraway. If you're really lucky, someone brings back dried fruit from the market. A fig and raisin loaf is practically dessert. You remember the time someone got their hands on saffron and made golden rolls that tasted like sunshine and hubris. You haven't seen that guy in a while. Probably moved to London or died of saffron poisoning. Not a thing, but who's fact-checking? You wipe the table clean with a chunk of stale crust and glance toward the flour sack, almost empty. You make a mental note to beg a favor at the mill, or maybe trade some eggs. Baking might feel routine, but it's a delicate daily dance with resources. Too wet, too dry, too cold, too hot. Each variable threatens disaster. And then there's the blessed loaf. On feast days, the village bakes a larger decorated bread offered at Mass. Sometimes it's even shaped like animals or angels. You remember once biting into a doughy lamb so undercooked it could have died. You still ate it. No regrets. By evening, the scent of bread lingers in the walls and your tunic. You've hidden the last piece under a bowl to keep it from mice, or your brother. It won't last long. Tomorrow, you'll start again. For now, you lie back, full of sourdough and pride. Not bad for glue bread. Not bad at all. The sharp tang of vinegar hits your nose before you even open the cellar hatch. You duck your head and descend into the cool gloom, wooden steps creaking under your weight, and are immediately surrounded by the quiet murmur of storage jars, tightly sealed barrels, and bundles of herbs hanging like upside-down ghosts. This is your sanctuary. This is your fridge, except it doesn't hum, and you can't accidentally leave the door open. In a world without refrigeration, preservation is everything. If you can't make your food last, you don't eat when the frost comes. Every meal in winter is a victory over time, rot, and really optimistic expiration dates, and you, humble peasant that you are becoming a preservation pro. First, the obvious one, salt. Salt is king. You use it to dry meats, pickle vegetables, and dehydrate fish until they could be used as roof tiles. A slab of pork, rubbed down with a crust of salt and stored in a clay pot, might last you through half the season. Granted, by the end, it tastes like you're chewing on a sweaty boot. But hey, protein is protein. Mainstream historical fact. Salting and drying were two of the most common methods of preservation in medieval Europe, especially in coastal and inland fishing communities. Cod and herring were salted in bulk, traded across regions, and sometimes shipped as far as the Mediterranean. These fish were the superstars of Lent when meat was off the table, but seafood got a holy thumbs up. In your cellar, there's a string of dried eels coiled in a jar like some horrible wizard's snack. You pretend not to notice the way they shift slightly when you walk past. Beside them is a barrel of pickled cabbage, sharp, slimy, and strangely addictive. You call it sour greens. Your mother calls it revenge on the intestines. And over there, the pride of your winter pantry, a ceramic jar of preserved eggs. You layered them in ashes and lye months ago. A technique you half learned from a wandering peddler who claimed it was how the Norse gods do breakfast. Historians still argue whether peasants actually used lye-based preservation or if that was more of a niche, regional trick. All you know is those eggs haven't exploded yet. Quirky fact. Some medieval people preserved fruits in honey, which wasn't just sweet but also antimicrobial. You have a small jar of honey plums somewhere, tucked behind the pickled beets. The top is crystallized like amber, and if you squint, it looks a little like treasure, which, considering the price of honey, it kind of is. Speaking of treasure, you also have vinegar. You make it yourself, sort of, by letting old wine or ale go sour. It's not exactly a controlled science. One batch turned purple and started bubbling like a witch's brew. You buried that one under the apple tree and decided not to talk about it. But your latest attempt worked. A strong, no-singing vinegar you now use to pickle onions, turnips, and whatever else you want to push into the future. You pull out a jar and hold it up to the flickering torchlight. Floating inside, baby carrots, mustard seeds, and a clove of garlic. It looks like a potion, and maybe it is. A potion against boredom, scurvy, and starvation. Drying is another trick up your sleeve. In summer you strung up apples to dry in the rafters. Now they're leathery rings you chew like fruit jerky. Herbs hang in bunches. Sage, thyme, rosemary. The smell is both medicinal and delicious. You crush a leaf between your fingers, and the scent blooms like a forgotten memory of sunshine. Sometimes, when you've really planned ahead, you smoke your food. Not the herbal kind, although you've seen your uncle puff dried nettle leaves behind the stable, convinced they cure gout. No, you're talking smoked meat. You built a rudimentary smokehouse out back, wood frame, thatched roof, and a chimney that mostly works. Inside, ham and sausages dangle like delicious wind chimes, soaking up that deep, dark, hickory flavor. You only open it on feast days, or when someone dies. Often the same thing. Historians still argue whether peasants had reliable access to smoking methods, or whether that was a luxury of estates and guilds. But you've made it work, through trial, error, and one small fire that almost took your eyebrows. You run your hand along the shelves, mentally inventorying your stock: pickled beans, salted goose, dried apples, smoked cheese wrapped in cloth, lard sealed in pots with rosemary sprigs, and a bucket of fermented turnips that smell like a crime scene. Nothing glamorous, but every jar, every strip of dried meat is a tiny defiance of the calendar. Fermentation is a whole category on its own. You have mead bubbling in the corner, honey wine, half dream, half experiment. A neighbor once taught you to make sauerkraut, and though the first batch tried to colonize the cellar, the second came out tangy and bright. Fermented food isn't just preserved. It's better, gut-friendly, trendy, if only your time had Instagram. Then there's the cheese. Glorious, stinky, stubborn cheese. You make soft cheese weekly using milk from the village goat herd and rennet from a calf's stomach. You hang curds in a cloth, press them with a rock, and age the firmer wheels in a damp corner. Molds bloom, rinds crack, mice try to infiltrate. It's a battle. But oh, the taste, sharp, nutty, earthy, alive. If your bread is your body, cheese is your soul. You sit on a crate and take a bite of pickled onion, chasing it with a cube of smoked pork. The flavors dance across your tongue, sour, salty, smoky. This isn't desperation. It's survival, yes, but also celebration. And it doesn't end here. Every preserved food connects you to a moment in time. The pickles from the harvest festival, the dried pears you swiped from a wedding table, the smoked fish from the river trip where your cousin fell in and came out smelling like eel forever. These aren't just stores, they're stories. You close the cellar hatch behind you and return to the hearth, cheeks pink from the cold. Dinner tonight won't be glamorous. A bit of bread, some pickled turnip, maybe a slice of that crumbly cheese. But it'll be safe, filling and full of memory. And that, in a world without ice boxes, is more than enough. You wake before the sun, and the first sound you hear is the slosh of milk in a wooden pail. Your hands are cold. Your breath fogs in the morning air. And somewhere nearby, a cow is mooing with the kind of energy that implies she wants her udder emptied now. Welcome to your new morning ritual, the noble, messy art of dairy production. Because even without refrigeration, medieval folk figured out how to make milk last. And not just last, but shine. Cheese, butter, curds, it's all on the menu, and it all starts with a slightly cranky cow and a lot of elbow grease. You trudge to the shed, bucket in hand. Your cow, let's call her Maud, greets you with the suspicious side eye of someone who's seen you fumble one too many milkings. You mutter your apologies, crouch low, and get to work, squeezing with a rhythm that feels more like music than manual labor. Warm milk hits the bucket with soft splashes. It's calming, meditative, and also a bit terrifying because fresh milk waits for no one. Without refrigeration, milk spoils within hours. But here's the magic. You don't need to keep it fresh, you need to transform it. You take the pail back inside, where the fire's already burning low, and strain the milk through a cloth to catch any, well, let's just call them natural floaters. Into a clay pot it goes, and you let it sit. Yes, just sit. Mainstream historical fact. Raw milk naturally separates over time. The cream floats to the top, and medieval people used this to their advantage. Once it rises, you skim it carefully and set it aside. Today's cream is tomorrow's butter. Now, you have two paths. If you want fresh cheese, you'll sour the milk, either with a splash of vinegar, lemon juice, if you're fancy, or rennet from an animal's stomach. That last one. It's an enzyme that curdles milk beautifully. You drop it in, stir gently, and wait as curds form like fluffy islands in a sea of whey. You scoop them into a cloth, twist the fabric, and hang it from a beam. Drip, drip, drip. Slowly, patiently, the whey drains out, leaving you with soft, crumbly cheese that you can salt and eat right away or shape into wheels for aging. If you're feeling ambitious, and let's be honest, you've got nothing better to do, you'll churn that cream instead. You grab the churn, pour the cream inside, and start pumping the plunger up and down. Minutes pass, then an hour. Your arms go numb, you start hallucinating conversations with St. Bridget, the patron of dairymaids. But eventually, miraculously, it happens. The cream clump separates, and suddenly you've got butter. Quirky fact, in some medieval households, butter was not just food, it was currency. People paid rents in butter, offered it to the church, and even used it as balm. One old tale insists that rubbing butter on a sword would make it more slippery in battle. Slippery, yes. Strategic, debatable. You knead the butter with salted hands, working out the last of the buttermilk. Then you pack it into a wooden mold, carving a little flower on top for decoration. It won't last long, but if you store it in a cool cellar or wrap it in dock leaves, you might stretch it through the week. Historians still argue whether most peasants had the means to age hard cheeses or if that was the domain of monasteries and manors. Aging cheese requires specific conditions: cool, damp cellars, constant turning, careful rinding. You've tried it once. You aged a small wheel of cheese behind your house for 2 months. It turned blue. You fed it to your brother. He cried. You now refer to that experiment as the blue tragedy. Today, you settle for fresh cheese, spread thick on brown bread with a sprinkle of salt, maybe some chopped herbs if you're feeling fancy. The taste is soft, tangy, almost lemony. It melts on your tongue with a gentle richness that's more satisfying than any roasted meat. Dairy isn't just for food either. You use the leftover whey in baking, or give it to pigs, or bathe in it if your skin is feeling particularly peasanty and you want a glow-up. Nobles pay through the nose for milk baths. You just dump what's left in a tub and hope the pigs don't drink it while you're soaking. And sometimes you let the milk go completely sour on purpose. Sour milk makes fantastic pancakes. You mix it with flour, eggs, and a hint of honey, then fry it on a hot stone. The edges go crispy, the middle stays soft, and the whole thing tastes like breakfast and survival had a baby. You remember once, during Lent, someone made cheese out of almond milk. That's right, fake cheese. You all pretended it tasted fine, but it was basically nut-flavored sadness. Still, a clever workaround when animal products were off-limits. Even back then, people had to follow rules they didn't always understand. The seasons matter too. In spring and summer, milk flows freely, and the butter is golden yellow from all the fresh herbs and wildflowers Maud munches on. In winter, the milk is scarce. the butter pale and waxy, you adjust, adapt, and learn to be grateful for what you have. You wrap your cheese in cloth, your butter in leaves, and place them carefully in your cellar. Tomorrow, you'll trade a wedge of cheese for eggs, or a fish, or a favor. Dairy isn't just sustenance, it's social currency. You're not just feeding yourself, you're feeding your reputation. Tonight, as the fire crackles low, you finish your dinner with a slice of barley cake and a smear of fresh butter. It's not fancy, but it's rich, honest, alive. And tomorrow, you'll do it all again. Maud will moo, you'll groan. The milk will splash, the cream will rise, and the cycle continues. Churn by churn, curd by curd. You lean against the doorway of your tiny kitchen space, or what counts as a kitchen in your world, and take a long sniff of the air. It's thick with smoke, yeast, and the toasty, slightly nutty aroma of something ancient and magical. Bread. More than just food, bread is the warm, rising heart of your daily survival. It's also the ultimate culinary shapeshifter. One day it's a rustic loaf, the next it's a trench for stew, a spoon, a plate, a sponge, or, when things go very wrong, a brick. You stretch and peer into your makeshift oven, a clay dome you built with the village potter's help. It's blackened from years of use, its cracks repaired with love, spit, and the occasional borrowed patch of goose fat. Inside, your daily loaf is baking, brown, uneven, and slightly lopsided, but it's holding together. And honestly, in medieval terms, that's pretty gourmet. Your dough started its life yesterday. You mixed coarse ground flour, barley this time, with a bit of leftover sourdough starter, salt, and water. No yeast packets here. Your leavening comes from the wild, mysterious world of fermentation. You keep a little crock of sourdough alive by feeding it flour and water every day, like a very smelly pet. Miss a feeding, and it starts to sulk. Miss two, and it becomes the kind of science experiment that might qualify for sainthood or exorcism. Mainstream historical fact. Bread was the foundation of most medieval diets. People in Northern Europe often consumed over a pound of bread per day. But not all bread was created equal. Nobles ate fine white loaves made from sifted wheat flour. You're chewing barley rye or oat bread so dense it could probably be used to patch a roof. Sometimes you throw in crushed peas, lentils, or even acorns, anything to stretch the flour and bulk up the dough. You've heard of famine bread, made with sawdust or bark. You haven't gone that far yet, but you've definitely flirted with mossy flour after a long, wet summer. There's also the issue of milling. You don't have a millstone of your own, so you pay the local miller a portion of your grain to use his equipment. He takes a scandalous cut, sometimes a third of your grain, but unless you feel like grinding it by hand for 6 hours a day, you don't have much choice. Historians still argue whether millers were universally corrupt or just victims of bad PR. You, personally, think his smug goat has something to do with it. Once milled, your flour lives in a tightly tied sack to keep out weevils. They still get in, of course. You just close your eyes and tell yourself the crunch is textural. It's fine. Protein. Quirky fact. In some towns, there were communal bakehouses. You'd bring your shaped dough, pay a small fee, and a professional baker would slide it into the great stone oven alongside everyone else's loaves. You'd mark your bread with a symbol, a star, a slash, your initials, so no one accidentally walked off with your dinner. You tried that once, forgot your mark. Came home with a loaf that smelled like onions and betrayal. Today, though, you've baked at home. You sit with the door ajar, letting the smoke out and watching the loaf develop its hard crust. You don't mind the chew. A tough crust means the bread lasts longer, even without a bread box or any fancy storage. You wrap loaves in cloth, tuck them into a dry corner, and try not to let the mice get there first. Bread isn't just food, it's your utensil. You use thick hunks to scoop broth, mop up gravy, or act as makeshift plates. Trench your bread. By the end of a meal, your bread plate is soaked with flavor. You can eat it or give it to the dog, or if you're particularly generous, pass it to the poor waiting outside the hall. You've also dabbled in flatbreads, quick to make and ideal when you forget to prep dough the night before. Flour, water, a pinch of salt, flattened and cooked on a hot stone. Done. You smear it with lard or onion paste, and it's basically medieval pizza. Okay, not really, but it gets the job done. Sometimes, when the wind is just right and the sun filters through the trees, you dream of sweet bread. You've heard nobles flavor theirs with saffron, sugar, even rose water. Once, during a fair, you tasted a honeyed roll so soft it almost floated. You cried a little. No shame. It was the closest thing to cake you've ever known. But back to reality. Your loaf is ready. You slide it out with a charred wooden peel and let it rest. It crackles as it cools, whispering its crusty secrets. You slice it open, steam rising in curls, and smear on a knob of yesterday's butter. It melts instantly. You take a bite. The crust crunches. The inside is slightly sour, a little chewy, and so satisfying it makes your toes wiggle. You dip the rest in some leftover broth and call it dinner. You still remember that time the baker tried to pass off a loaf with a mouse baked inside, said it was a bonus. You started baking at home after that. You also remember the times when grain ran low and you rationed slices like gold coins. When bread was thin, you were thinner, but now, with a good harvest and a well-fed starter, you've got a few decent loaves tucked away. Enough to share, enough to live. You take a second slice. Butter this time with a pinch of salt and a smear of wild garlic paste. You're a king in this moment, a crusty, tired, bread-scented king. Outside, the light is fading. You wrap your loaf in cloth and store it on a shelf, out of reach of nibbling teeth. Tomorrow it'll be a little tougher, a little drier, but you'll toast it on the hearthstone, or dunk it in stew, or crumble it into milk for breakfast. Bread, humble and eternal, will always be waiting. The wind rustles the hedgerow as you crouch low, squinting into the underbrush with the intense focus of a treasure hunter. But you're not looking for gold. You're looking for something far more precious, dinner. More specifically, something green or leafy, or possibly edible, assuming it's not the plant that made your cousin hallucinate that time. You are foraging, every medieval peasant's fallback plan when food runs low, markets are too far, or you just really want to add something fresh to your bowl of gruel. And honestly, you're pretty good at it. Right now, you've got a woven basket slung over your arm and an eye out for nettles, wild garlic, dandelion leaves, sorrel, and chickweed. These humble greens are your vitamins, your salad course, your garnish, your medicine, and your desperate attempt to avoid scurvy. You reach for a patch of nettles. Carefully. You know better than to grab them bare-handed after last week's incident with the rash that looked like a map of Europe. This time, you pinch off the tender tips with a cloth and tuck them gently into your basket. Once cooked, they'll taste like spinach with a bit of an attitude. And they're loaded with iron, or, so the herbalist claims, in between boiling squirrel skulls for clarity of thought. Mainstream historical fact. Foraging wasn't just for peasants. Even wealthier households sent out servants to gather seasonal wild herbs and greens. In some monastic kitchens, herbs like parsley, mint, and fennel were prized additions, carefully catalogued and grown in tidy gardens. But wild greens were the original side dish, collected daily and eaten fresh. Today, you spot some wood sorrel. The leaves look like shamrocks and have a bright lemony snap to them. Perfect for cutting through the heaviness of barley stew. A few wild mushrooms peek out from the base of a damp tree trunk, but you hesitate. Mushrooms are a gamble. You've eaten delicious chanterelles before, and you've also spent an entire night hallucinating your goat was singing hymns. So, you pass. Quirky fact, there's an old belief that if a hedgehog eats a mushroom, it's safe for humans too. You don't have a hedgehog. You do have a brother willing to taste test, but he's still recovering from last month's surprise root pie. You gather a few flower heads from daisies and violets, purely decorative, of course, but they make your plate look like you tried. You remember seeing noble feasts with candied violets and rose petal syrup. You once tried boiling rose petals into something resembling jelly. It ended up more like mushy perfume, but hey, you tried. Further down the path, you find ground elder. It grows like a weed, which is great because that means you can take as much as you like. Tossed into a pottage, it adds a parsley-like freshness. You pair it with some dock leaves, sour and grassy, but not bad when wilted with a bit of lard. You glance up and spot a squirrel watching you, judging you, probably worried you're stealing his pantry. You give him a solemn nod. Mutual respect among foragers. Historians still argue whether most medieval foraging was opportunistic or if people passed down specific sophisticated knowledge. There's evidence of herbals, illustrated guides to plants and their uses, but whether your average peasant could read one is another story. You go by smell, texture, and family stories that start with, "Don't touch that unless you want to see fairies." By the time you head home, your basket is full and your fingers stained green. You set everything on the wooden slab that passes for a prep table and begin washing each leaf in a bowl of rainwater. A few bugs float up. You fish them out and sigh. Extra protein, nature's little bonus. You throw a handful of chopped nettles, dock, and sorrel into the bubbling cauldron. They wilt instantly, turning your broth a vivid, swampy green. It smells earthy, but in a good way. You crumble in some old bread to thicken it, add a pinch of salt, and stir until it looks like something a monk might serve with a sermon about humility. Sometimes you dry herbs on strings across your hearth, thyme, sage, wild marjoram, so you have a stash during winter. They don't stay fragrant long, but even a faint whiff of flavor in January can feel like cheating death. You also remember that weird week when the herbalist convinced everyone to eat tansy leaves, supposed to cleanse the humors. Half the village cleansed themselves, right into bed with stomach cramps. You stick to what you know now. Tonight's stew is rustic, to say the least. But as you dip your spoon, wooden scoop, into the bowl and blow gently on the steam, you're pleasantly surprised. It's tangy, bright, almost like spring in a pot. You chew slowly, savoring the bite of sorrel and the deep green flavor of nettles. It tastes alive, which is more than you can say for last week's turnips. You serve the rest with slices of barley bread, maybe a bit of fresh cheese if you're lucky. It's humble, yes, but there's something deeply satisfying about eating food that was literally growing outside your door just hours ago. And if you're lucky, you might even impress the neighbors. Oh, this, just something I threw together from the hedgerow. You say it casually, but inside, you're beaming. There's something ancient about foraging, something that connects you to every ancestor who ever bent down, sniffed a leaf, and thought, well, let's see if this kills me. So far, you're still standing and full. You're elbow deep in a wooden tub of cabbage, and your fingers are starting to prune. The scent wafting up is sharp, pungent, a little eye-watering, definitely not the kind of thing you'd spritz behind your ears unless you wanted to attract a very confused goat. But you're not making perfume. You're preserving vegetables, and tonight's star is sauerkraut. You press the shredded cabbage down hard, listening for that soft squish and the satisfying hiss of bubbling brine. It's alive. That's a good sign. Not monster in the cellar alive, but beautifully, chemically, gloriously alive with lactofermentation. It's medieval food science at its tastiest. Without refrigeration, fermentation is your best friend, and sometimes your only one, when it comes to keeping vegetables edible through long winters or long plagues. You salt the cabbage, not just for flavor, but to kill off the bad bacteria while encouraging the good ones to party. The result? Tangy, crunchy, probiotic goodness that might just help you survive another season of salt pork and questionable turnips. Mainstream historical fact. Fermentation was common across medieval Europe. From sauerkraut in the Germanic regions to pickled beets, onions, and even carrots in England and France, people preserved vegetables with salt, vinegar, or brine as a hedge against scarcity. The monasteries were particularly good at it, Some even had dedicated fermentation cellars. You jam another layer of cabbage into the barrel, sprinkle more salt, and weigh it down with a smooth stone. It'll need to sit in your root cellar for weeks, sometimes months, to reach peak flavor. But you're patient. You've waited longer for a priest to finish grace. Alongside the cabbage, you're also working on pickled onions, tiny fiery little things you've peeled with tears in your eyes and tucked into a jar with vinegar, mustard seeds, and a dried chili someone traded for a sack of oats. They'll burn a hole in your mouth, but they'll wake you up in the morning better than a slap from a nun. Quirky fact: some medieval folks believed pickled vegetables kept the humors in balance, especially the black bile that caused melancholy. You're not sure about all that, but you do feel a little cheerier after a bite of garlicky pickled turnip. Now, vinegar isn't something you buy at the market in a glass bottle. No, you make your own by letting leftover ale or wine turn sour, on purpose this time. You keep a vinegar mother, a sort of slimy, jelly-like mass that floats in your fermentation jar. It looks like something out of a bog, but it's pure culinary gold. Without it, there's no vinegar, and without vinegar, there's no pickling. You remember the time your vinegar jar cracked and leaked all over the pantry. Everything smelled like pickled despair for a week. Still, you press on. Because winter is always coming, and if you don't stock up now, you'll be gnawing on dried beans and regret by February. Historians still argue whether medieval fermentation was more flavor-driven or simply about survival. You suspect it was both. Sure, pickled cabbage isn't a luxury dish, but after 3 weeks of boiled barley and hard cheese, it tastes like ambrosia. Plus, it helps your digestion. You're not exactly regular on a diet of salted meat and mush. You wipe your hands on your apron and open a different jar. Fermented turnips this time. They smell assertive, but you've learned to trust the funk. You scoop some onto your bread and chew slowly. Sharp, sour, and surprisingly juicy. You chase it with a hunk of cheese and feel your belly sigh in relief. You've also dabbled in preserving beets in honeyed vinegar, a trick you learned from a traveling tinker who swore it would make your innards sing. It didn't, but the beet-pink stains on your tunic are oddly festive. In the corner, a crock of fermented garlic bubbles quietly. You're pretty sure it's not sentient, but you don't make eye contact just in case. The cloves have mellowed into sweet, tangy bombs of flavor. 1 or 2 of those in a pottage can change your whole evening. There's also that one batch of pickled mushrooms you buried in a jar 6 months ago and promptly forgot. You eye the lid cautiously. Might be treasure, might be terror. You decide to give it another week. Fermentation isn't just for vegetables either. Your neighbors sometimes ferment dairy into kefir or clabber, and in the monasteries they've got crocks of fish sauce fermenting into an unholy stench they swear makes everything taste better. You've smelled it. You disagree. Still, you admire their dedication. Fermenters are like alchemists, taming rot into flavor, turning spoilage into storage. You've got shelves lined with jars, crocks, and bottles. Some are delicious. Some are mistakes. All of them are stories. And sometimes, just sometimes, a preserved jar of turnips makes the difference between a long, miserable winter and a decent one. Tonight's supper is a bowl of pottage thickened with oats and shredded kale, topped with a spoonful of your sauerkraut and a generous sprinkle of pickled onion. It's not fancy, but it's warm, tangy, and alive with flavor. You eat slowly with your feet near the fire, and your thoughts drift to spring. Because while the ground may be frozen and the field silent, your food, your pickles and krauts and vinegars, is still buzzing, still transforming, still bringing life into your wooden bowl. And really, who needs a refrigerator when you've got a barrel, a handful of salt, and just the right amount of fermentation magic? Your fingers are crusted with flour, your sleeves dusted white. Your fingers are crusted with flour, your sleeves dusted white like a snowfall happened only to you. The wooden table before you is strewn with bowls, a doughy lump resting stubbornly under your palms, and you're muttering something halfway between a prayer and a curse. Welcome to baking day. The oven's still warming, basically a glorified stone igloo you've fed sticks and branches into all morning. It's a communal affair. You and several other villagers take turns with your loaves, swapping gossip and side-eyeing anyone who dares underbake their rye again. But today, it's your dough in the spotlight. Bread isn't just food. It's survival, social currency, and theological metaphor, all rolled into one crusty, yeasty wheel of destiny. Without refrigeration, bread has to last, which means it needs to be dense, dry, and preferably resistant to the advances of mold. Your secret weapon? Sourdough starter, a gloopy, ancient-smelling mixture of flour and wild yeast you keep alive in a clay pot like it's your fifth child. You feed it scraps of dough and whisper to it on cold nights. It's temperamental, but it gives your loaves their life. Mainstream historical fact: bread was a daily staple across all classes in the medieval world. Poorer folk relied on coarser grains like rye, barley, or even peas and beans ground into meal, while the wealthy indulged in soft white loaves made from refined wheat flour. In many regions, bread accounted for the majority of daily caloric intake. Your batch today is made from maslin, a flour blend of rye and wheat. Rye's cheaper, heartier, and keeps better in damp climates. It makes a heavy loaf, dark and sour, but satisfying. You've mixed in a bit of ground fennel seed, both for flavor and because the herbalist said it encourages good wind. You don't ask follow-up questions. As you knead, the dough begins to smooth, elastic under your hands. You fold it over itself again and again. You might not have a timer, but you know by feel when it's right. There's no recipe, just rhythm, muscle memory, grandma memory. Quirky fact: in some towns, bakers had to mark their loaves with a unique stamp or symbol in case of fraud or underweight bread. If you sold light bread, you could be fined, or worse, shamed in the pillory with stale rolls hurled at your head. Baking justice was swift and starchy. You formed the dough into round boules and set them on cabbage leaves to rise. No fancy pans here, just leaf-lined baskets and hope. While they puff up near the hearth, you turn to your favorite side hustle, hardtack. Yes, the dreaded ship's biscuit. You mix flour and water into a stiff, joyless paste, shape it into thick squares, and poke holes with a sharp twig. Once baked, it's tough as old sandals and lasts for months, sometimes years, if you keep it dry. Perfect for storing in the pantry or carrying on long trips, assuming you don't mind chipping a tooth. Historians still argue whether medieval people preferred fresh bread daily or intentionally made batches to last a week or more. Evidence from monastic kitchens suggests both were common. Fresh loaves for feasting days, tougher ones stored for lean times. You bake once or twice a week, and between meals you keep the loaves in a sack hung from a ceiling beam, out of reach of rats, toddlers, and hungry husbands. The oven is ready, smoke curls gently from its top, the inside roaring with heat. You and the other bakers shovel in your loaves with long wooden paddles, arranging them in a tight circle. The smell is instant: warmth, yeast, browning crust. It makes your stomach growl. You retreat outside to wait. The baker's queue has turned into an impromptu market. Someone's selling goose eggs. Someone else is trading nettle cordials for onion pickles. A child runs past with a turnip like it's a football. You take it all in, then duck back inside to check your loaves. Perfect! Golden brown on top, slightly cracked on the edges. You wrap the bottom and listen for the hollow sound of success. Out they come, steaming, proud, and ready to feed your household for days, maybe even a week if nobody gets snacky after dark. While the loaves cool, you set one aside for the priest. It's tradition, and also convenient if you need a favor during confession. Another goes to your neighbor in trade for goat cheese. Two stay with you, and one gets dried overnight for breadcrumbs and stuffing. At home, you slice a wedge of bread and smear it with bean paste, sprinkle a little salt, and top it with fermented radish slices. It's crunchy, salty, sour, and deeply satisfying. The crust is chewy, the inside soft with just enough spring. No butter in sight, too expensive, but you don't miss it, much. You also remember your emergency bread, trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread used as plates. They soak up stew and gravy, and when they're too soggy to hold, you either eat them or toss them to the dogs. Or, if you're particularly holy, you give them to beggars outside the church. It's food, tableware, and moral point scorer all in one. By the end of the evening, your kitchen smells like a bakery. The hearth is dimming, the loaves are stacked, and your sourdough starter is tucked away in its pot, quietly bubbling like a creature that dreams of carbs. There's no fridge humming in the background, no plastic wrap, no preservatives, just flour, water, salt, fire, and patience. And yet, this bread might outlast the month, maybe even the rats. You count that as a win. The sun's slipping low behind the trees, and the pigs are snuffling at your heels. They know it's coming. You've got a wooden bucket sloshing with something between porridge and swamp juice. Pig slop, glorious pig slop. But tonight isn't just about feeding them. Tonight, you're thinking about eating them. Not now, mind you, but soon. Because pigs aren't just pets with personality, they're walking larders. And in a world without refrigeration, they're one of your best bets for meat that won't rot before dinner. You watch them root in the mud, their snouts twitching. A few months from now, one of these oinkers will become sausages, bacon, and a dozen other preserved treasures. For now, though, it's all about fattening them up. And you've got scraps for days. Cabbage cores, oat hulls, stale bread, even the odd apple peel. They're not picky. Mainstream historical fact. Pigs were the most commonly kept livestock in medieval Europe, especially among peasants. They required less grazing land than cattle, could be fed kitchen waste, and produced a wide range of meat products that could be cured, salted, smoked, or dried to last through winter. You rub your shoulder, still sore from hauling firewood to the smokehouse earlier, because once a pig is butchered, the real work begins, and it's a race against time. Without cold storage, every part must be processed fast or risk spoilage. You've helped with enough slaughters to know the drill: gut, skin, hang, carve, cure. It's messy, it's smelly, and it's oddly satisfying. A sort of culinary triage. You remember last year's pig, big, bristly beast named Wilbert. The whole village helped process him. You cured the hams with a mix of salt, crushed juniper berries, and a prayer. Then came the sausages, strung up in neat rows like edible garlands, slowly drying in the smokehouse. Quirky fact. Some sausages in medieval Europe were so long-lasting, they were traded like currency. A good smoked link could buy you a basket of eggs or a small favor from the reeve, assuming it wasn't nibbled by mice first. Tonight, you're working on a batch of blood pudding. Sounds grim, but it's practically a delicacy. You mix fresh pig's blood with oats, onions, and herbs, stuff it into a cleaned casing, and set it to simmer. The smell is rich, iron-like, and strangely comforting. Some folks can't stomach it, others fight for seconds. Next to the fire, you've got a pot of lard slowly rendering down. The fat melts into a pale gold liquid, perfect for sealing cooked meat in jars, or frying root vegetables into crispy indulgence. Nothing goes to waste. Not the trotters, not the ears, not even the snout. A clever cook can turn pigskin into crunchy crackling and boiled bones into a broth so thick it wobbles like jelly. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants actually ate meat often or saved it for feast days and hard winters. Some records suggest most folks had small amounts regularly, bits of salted pork added to stews or scraps of bacon fried with onions. Others insist meat was a luxury and pigs were more valuable alive than dead. You eat meat sparingly, it's precious, and you've worked hard for every scrap. Tonight's dinner is bean stew with a slice of smoked bacon added for flavor. Just one. That single piece perfumes the whole pot. The cured meats hang overhead in the loft, away from vermin and curious children. They swing slightly in the breeze from the chimney. their surfaces darkened from weeks of smoke. You're partial to your smoked jowls, fatty, salty, slightly sweet. A slice on a chunk of rye bread is the kind of thing that could make you weep, and not just from the salt. In a corner crock, you've buried a small ham in a salt brine mixture. It's heavy with rosemary, garlic, and peppercorns. You'll leave it there for a few weeks before hanging it to dry. Then it'll last for months, long enough to get you through Lent or another round of rainy weeks that turn your grain stores into mold festivals. You also trade with the neighbors. One of them has a smokehouse big enough to handle multiple carcasses at once. You send over your sides of pork, and in return, they bring back sausages strung like necklaces and slabs of bacon as long as your arm. You've got an informal bacon co-op going, and frankly, it works. There's one jar in your pantry that's particularly special: rillettes. You slow-cooked shredded pork with lard, herbs, and just enough salt, then packed it into a clay pot and sealed it under more fat. It keeps for weeks, even without a cold place. You scoop a bit now and spread it on bread. It's silky, meaty, decadent. Honestly, it could win awards if medieval food had competitions. You glance out the window. The pigs are asleep, curled like hairy boulders. You feel a pang of guilt, but also respect. They're part of your survival. You give them your scraps, your leftovers, your stale crusts. In return, they give you sustenance that can last through storms, sickness, and shortages. In a world without refrigerators, pigs are mobile meat banks. They're insurance policies on 4 legs. They store calories as fat, and you just have to know how to access that savings account at the right time with a good knife and a sharp sense of timing. You stretch your arms, the smell of smoked meat clinging to your tunic, and stoke the fire one last time. The blood pudding has cooled. You cut a slice, fry it in the lard, and take a bite. Crispy on the outside, creamy in the middle, heavy with sage. You chew slowly, satisfied. Winter may come. The cellar may be dark. The days may be short. But you've got pork in the rafters, bacon in the crock, and sausage drying in the chimney smoke. And really, that's all the comfort you need. The wind sneaks under the thatched eaves and whistles past your pantry door, where rows of ceramic jars stand like silent sentries. You open one carefully. Ah, the unmistakable whiff of vinegar and garlic. You're not just storing food, you're preserving time. And tonight, it's all about pickles. Forget cucumbers in neon green brine. These are pickles of a different breed. Turnips, onions, cabbage, even bits of leftover meat or eggs if you're feeling bold. Everything you can't eat right away gets dunked in something sour, salty, or both. No fridge? No problem. You've got a shelf full of controlled rot. You drop a handful of chopped carrots into a crock and ladle over hot vinegar, spiced with mustard seed, dill, and a dash of crushed cloves. You press them down with a smooth river stone, ensuring they're fully submerged. Exposure to air means mold, and mold means dinner becomes pig slop. Again, mainstream historical fact. Pickling was one of the most reliable methods of food preservation in medieval Europe, especially for vegetables and fish. Brine and vinegar stop bacteria in their tracks, allowing families to keep produce through the long winter months. Your favorite is sauerkraut, fermented cabbage that starts life crunchy and bland, but turns into something sour, zingy, and slightly fizzy. It's cabbage with attitude. You slice the leaves thin, toss them with salt, and mash them with a wooden pestle until they give up their juices. Then you pack them into a barrel and weigh it down. A week or two later, sauerkraut magic. That fizzy tang? That's lacto-fermentation, though you don't know the term. All you know is that when the brine bubbles and the kraut smells just right, you're in for a treat. Eat it alone, toss it in a pottage, or serve it beside salted pork to cut the richness. It's bright, sharp, and has the side benefit of terrifying your more timid neighbors. Quirky fact, medieval folk sometimes pickled entire fish, bones, guts, and all. The longer it sat, the more potent the flavor. There are records of people eating herring pickled so long it dissolved the wooden spoons used to stir it. You like a little tang, but maybe not that much. Tonight, you're layering beet slices with garlic and cloves in a shallow jar, covering it all with wine vinegar, so red it glows like a stained glass window. In a week, it'll be punchy and earthy, perfect for brightening up your boiled barley. Yes, pickles are the original flavor bombs. Who needs hot sauce when you've got fermented leeks? Next to the beets, you've got onions, soaking in honeyed vinegar, and another jar with green beans brined in salt water, speckled with dill seeds and a whisper of horseradish root. Each one tastes like a different season. Summer preserved for winter, autumn bottled for spring. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants actively enjoyed their preserved foods or simply endured them. Sure, fresh was better, but when the only alternative is chewing on a frozen parsnip, a tangy bit of pickled turnip feels like a festival. Some even believed fermented foods improved digestion, or at least explained the winds that came after. You chuckle, wiping vinegar from your hands. A breeze rattles the shutter, and you reach for your backup stash. Eggs stored in ash. Yes, really. You take fresh eggs, coat them in a thin layer of wood ash or slake lime, and tuck them into a clay jar. No boiling, no pickling, just slow mineral magic. Weeks later, they're still edible, though the texture is, let's say, unique. You crack one open. The yolk is firm, the white rubbery. Not delicious exactly, but it'll do in a pinch. You mash it with mustard and vinegar, slather it on a slice of toasted bread, and call it dinner. Or is it breakfast? You've kind of lost track. Further back on the shelf, there's a sealed jar of pickled mushrooms, delicate caps you foraged in the woods last month. You boiled them in vinegar, tossed in bay leaf and peppercorns, and sealed them tight. They're slippery, chewy, and so strongly flavored they punch you right in the taste buds. One is plenty. Two is a dare. You even have pickled fruit. Pear slices in honey vinegar, a medieval hack for keeping sweetness in the off-season. You serve them as a side with roast parsnips or sneak one now and then straight from the jar. Sweet, sour, a little crunchy. It's dessert with an attitude. You remember a winter festival last year where someone brought pickled walnuts. You bit into one expecting a nutty crunch and instead got hit with a flavor tornado. Bitter, sour, earthy, and oddly meaty. You're still not sure whether it was delicious or a prank. The trick to it all is balance. Too much salt, and the food becomes inedible. Too little, and you invite mold colonies to the party. You've learned to trust your nose and your eyes. If it fizzes, smells sour but not foul, and doesn't have fur growing on top, it's probably safe. Probably. And there's pride in your jars. Each one tells a story. This one's the onions from your aunt's wedding. That one's the beans you picked just before the frost hit. The sauerkraut? That's from the cabbage patch you thought the goats had destroyed. But somehow it bounced back. Miracles do happen. You pack the jars tightly onto the shelf, wrapping a few in cloth to keep out the light. You rotate the old ones forward, pull the crusted lid off one of last year's forgotten turnip crocks, wince, and throw it to the pigs. Even you have limits. At the end of the night, your pantry smells like vinegar and herbs and old earth. You run your fingers over the tops of the jars, each one humming with quiet potential. They won't last forever, but for now, they're little promises tucked behind wooden doors. When the snow traps you indoors and the stew gets repetitive, it'll be these pickles that wake your palate, make your meal sparkle, and remind you that flavor, like life, doesn't always need to be fresh to be good. It's just past midnight now, and the fire has mellowed into a quiet, flickering glow. Your breath still puffs in the chill because medieval insulation is mostly wishful thinking, and you pull your cloak tighter as you crouch beside the hearth. Tonight, you're checking on your best frenemy, the root cellar. You step carefully down the worn stone steps, lantern in hand, into a pocket of earth cool enough to keep a turnip asleep for months. There's no modern hum of a compressor here, no fridge magnets or light bulbs. just a carved-out belly of the ground, dark and damp, and filled with the quiet ambition of survival. Root cellars were widely used across medieval Europe to store vegetables, grains, and even barrels of beer or cider. By using the naturally cool, stable temperature of underground spaces, people could extend the life of perishables without refrigeration, sometimes by several months. You duck your head to avoid a cobweb that's clearly staked permanent claim to the ceiling. The smell is part loam, part onion, and part something you'd rather not investigate too closely. You've arranged your bounty by type: carrots stacked like firewood, beets piled in sand, cabbages hanging by their stalks from thick twine. You dig into a shallow pit filled with straw and pull out a couple of parsnips. Still firm, still sweet. You brush them off on your tunic, which at this point might be cleaner than your hands. It's not glamorous, but it works. You could practically hear your ancestors whisper, "If it ain't moldy, it's dinner." Some of your best tricks involve sand. Carrots and beets do wonderfully if buried in slightly damp sand, layered so they don't touch. The sand absorbs excess moisture and discourages rot. Bonus, it's basically nature's bubble wrap. You've lost fewer vegetables this year thanks to it, and fewer tears too. You've got baskets of onions plaited and hung in long braids like garlands of dragon teeth. They repel pests and add a bit of witchy charm to the place. Garlic, too, whole ropes of it swinging lazily in the draft. If you ever wanted to cosplay a vampire hunter, this is the moment. In some medieval regions, people believed keeping certain vegetables, like leeks and onions, buried in earth or hung in root cellars would ward off evil spirits. You're not saying it works, but you haven't been cursed yet. Coincidence. You nudge a barrel of apples and lift the lid. A few have gone soft, but most still shine with that dull, waxy coat that says, "I'm doing my best." Some are yellowing, others spotted. None are perfect, but they'll still cook down into a mash or bake into something resembling a pie. Close enough, really. There's a second barrel deeper in filled with grains. Mostly rye, some barley. Kept dry, they'll last for years. You check for weevils, not the best midnight snack, and give the sack a shake. Clean. Good. Maybe tomorrow you'll grind a bit for porridge or make flatbread with a few dried herbs. Something warm, something simple. Historians still argue whether root cellars were common in every peasant home or more often used by wealthier households and monasteries. Some say small folk made do with buried crocks in the garden or cold corners of their cottages. Others point to archaeological finds of dug-out storage pits lined with straw and stone. You know your cellar isn't fancy, but it saved you more times than you can count. When the roads freeze and markets vanish into the snow, your larder becomes a treasure trove. You once lived off potatoes and cabbage for nearly 3 weeks and emerged only slightly bitter about it. The only problem is root cellars are temperamental. Too dry and things shrivel. Too wet and everything rots. You've learned to vent the air just right, crack the hatch on dry days, seal it tight when rain threatens. It's less like maintaining a pantry and more like caring for a particularly moody badger that happens to contain your dinner. You open a side jar buried in the back corner. What's this? A forgotten crock of salted leeks. You scoop a bit out, sharp, funky, and surprisingly good, like chewing on a briny scallion that's been aging in suspense. You'll add it to stew tomorrow. Waste not, want not, as the elders mutter with grim pride. There's one shelf that always makes you smile. It's your maybe food, maybe science shelf. Things you're experimenting with, like storing turnips in ash or burying pears wrapped in leaves to see if they ripen slower. One time you tried coating apples in beeswax. It sort of worked. Mostly you just made sticky fruit. Lesson learned. At the far end of the cellar, a single candle flickers beside your clay jugs of cider and ale. They're naturally cool down here, which helps preserve the precious brew. Some evenings you sneak down for a sip. Just a small one. It's not hoarding if it's strategic. You pause by the cabbage ropes. They've dried into leathery leaves, curling like ancient scrolls. not good for fresh eating, but perfect for soup stock or wrapping bits of grain and meat into steaming bundles. You've gotten creative down here. Hunger will do that to a person. You close the cellar door behind you and let the dark embrace its hoard again. Your hands are cold, your knees ache, but your heart, it's oddly full, because even though there's no hum of a refrigerator, no glass jars clinking with factory labels, this place holds the future. Your future. You've bent time with vinegar, buried seasons in sand, and tricked root vegetables into sleeping until spring. You've turned absence into abundance, at least enough abundance to get by. And really, in this world, that's the dream. You're back above ground now, and the morning light is doing its best to seep through the clouds like lukewarm tea through a muslin cloth. Breakfast time. But what even is breakfast in the Middle Ages? You stretch, crack your back like it's a stiff drawbridge, and start assembling something that counts as a meal, because, let's face it, cold barley mash isn't exactly Eggs Benedict. You scrape the crust off last night's leftover oat pottage, toss it into a pan with a splash of ale, and stir until it gives up and becomes warmish again. That's breakfast, technically. For much of the medieval period, breakfast wasn't always considered a proper meal. In fact, it was sometimes seen as a sign of weakness, like only children, the elderly, or laborers needed it. The more devout believed a hearty meal before morning mass was indulgent at best, sinful at worst. But you're a peasant. You've got chores, aches, a crumbling roof to patch, and possibly 3 teeth left in decent shape. So yes, you're eating, and maybe sneaking seconds. Today's breakfast options depend entirely on what's left from the night before. Bread, of course, if any remains unsnatched by mice or wandering siblings. A bit of cheese hard enough to scrape sparks if you dropped it. Maybe a smear of lard or a pickled egg if you're lucky. Protein was a guest star in your diet, not a regular. You pick up an old favorite, bread soaked in ale. Call it what you want, poor man's pudding, chewable beer, sadness stew. It sticks to your ribs. You soften it over the fire, drizzle in a pinch of honey if you're feeling fancy, and there you go. Medieval French toast without the eggs, butter, or dignity. You chew slowly, savoring the way it glues your molars together. It's oddly comforting. Maybe that's what breakfast really is, the edible version of shrugging into your day. Some monasteries allowed a kind of breakfast called misericordia, a special meal for those who were elderly, ill, or on special labor duties. It wasn't advertised, but you could slip in and grab a bowl of broth or bread before the main meal time. Think of it as medieval VIP brunch, minus the mimosas. On feast days, rare, joyous, chaotic, you might get something sweet. Pancakes, sort of. More like fried blobs of dough made from rye flour and eggs, if the hens were cooperating. You'd drizzle it with honey or smear it with apple paste, and for a moment breakfast felt like a gift. But most mornings, you're scraping dried peas from the bottom of a pot and pretending it's intentional. Historians still argue whether the lower classes in medieval Europe had regular access to what we'd now call breakfast foods. Some suggest it was a luxury tied to the household's size and wealth. Others argue that while formal breakfast wasn't standard, most people working the field simply ate early, out of necessity. Ritual, be damned. You tend to side with the eat-when-you-can crowd. Because honestly, who's telling the guy milking the cow at 4 a.m. that breakfast is spiritually suspicious? You check your pantry for dried apples. They're leathery now, almost chewy, but still sweet enough to pass as a treat. You toss a few into your pottage bowl, texture achieved. You call it rustic, which is medieval for this is what I found. If you've got a bit of leftover fish, salted, dried, or smoked, you'll slice it thin and eat it with bread. Cold fish for breakfast? Sounds weird to you now, but it was a staple back then. Protein, salt, and a bit of chew. Add ale to wash it down, and you've recreated what many villagers ate before heading into the fields. There's also gruel. Yes, the word itself sounds sad, but it's not all bad. Think of it as oatmeal's older, thinner, more cynical cousin. made from oats, barley, or rye boiled in water or milk if you have it, sometimes seasoned with a scrap of animal fat or chopped herbs. You sip it, not chew it. A good gruel morning is when it's thick enough to stand your spoon in. A bad gruel morning? You just drink it and try not to cry. But if you're truly blessed, someone might have made a soft cheese from last week's milk, simple curds pressed into a cloth, left to drain, and sprinkled with salt. Slathered on warm bread, it's heaven, or the medieval approximation of it. You look around your space, rough stone walls, straw-stuffed bedding, and a shelf with 3 onions and a loaf of yesterday's bread. Not glamorous, but you've got food. That's more than some can say. You sip your small beer, a very weak ale, barely fermented, just enough to make the water safer, and chase it with a hunk of bread, hydration and carbs in one go. Breakfast efficiency. Who needs orange juice? And let's talk leftovers. Medieval folk didn't believe in waste. That half an onion, toss it into the morning stew. That bit of mashed pea, mix it with barley. There's no shame in remixing your food like a bad minstrel recycling rhymes. You remember one time someone made a morning hash from turnip tops, a poached egg, and crushed walnuts. It was ambitious, but oddly tasty. You call it breakfast surprise. The surprise is that it's edible. You scrape your bowl, licking the spoon. Another morning survived, another meal accomplished. You sit back, belly not quite full but no longer hollow, and listen to the village begin to stir. Church bells echo through the fog, and somewhere a rooster finally decides to wake up. Late as always. You brush crumbs from your tunic and rise. The day is waiting. And so is the next meal, if you're lucky, if you're clever, and if the cellar doesn't turn against you. In a world without fridges, breakfast is never a guarantee, but it's always a small triumph, one warm bowl at a time. You're outside now, crouched by a muddy lane as dawn stretches her arms across the treetops. The chickens are judging you again, heads cocked, eyes suspicious, as if they know you once tried to make soup out of one of their cousins. But you're not here to win poultry approval, you're here to forage. Yes, you, out in the hedgerows with a basket and a suspiciously sharp knife, hoping to find something edible that won't poison you or taste like regret. Because here's the truth. Not everything people ate in the Middle Ages came from neatly plowed fields or bustling markets. A surprising amount came from what you could gather with your own 2 hands, and a good working knowledge of what wouldn't kill you. Mainstream historical fact. Foraging was a common part of daily life in medieval Europe, especially for the lower classes. Wild greens, berries, nuts, and herbs filled in nutritional gaps when cultivated food was scarce or expensive. Many of these finds also played roles in medicine and ritual. You start with wild garlic. It carpets the forest floor like someone spilled a green quilt under the trees. The leaves smell sharp, clean, and promising. You snip a few bunches, enough to add flavor to soup, maybe mash into soft cheese. The real prize, though, are the bulbs, spicy, earthy, and a miracle for your sinuses. Nearby nettles wave gently. A younger, you might have avoided them like plague. But now you know that nettles, once boiled, lose their sting and make a soup so iron-rich you could almost feel your blood applauding. You pick them carefully. Gloves on, no heroics. Even in the Middle Ages, there's no reward for a rashy hand. You scan the edges of the forest and spot a scattering of mushrooms. Tempting, deadly, tricky. You squint, kneel, sniff. This one might be an edible field mushroom, or it might be a cousin of doom. You leave it be. Because being brave is good, but being alive is better. Quirky fact. Some medieval folk believed that mushrooms grew where lightning struck. The logic? Lightning came from God. So did mushrooms. Therefore, mushrooms were sacred, or depending on your village's interpretation, demon spawn. Eating them was either divine or very, very bad. You spot some chickweed, soft and mild, growing in a shady patch. It's not glamorous, but you've chewed worse. You'll add it to tonight's stew for a bit of green. It's almost like salad, if salad didn't involve forks, oil, or dignity. Farther along, you find hazelnuts. Most are gone now, squirrels are faster than you, and possibly unionized, but you snag a few from the base of a tree. Cracked open with a stone, they taste like effort and reward. You pocket the good ones and move on. Historians still argue whether medieval people had a systematic knowledge of foraging or simply relied on passed-down lore. Some say herbalists and midwives kept this knowledge alive through oral tradition. Others argue that most people knew just enough to survive and occasionally made deadly mistakes. You remember the story of a neighbor's cousin who once brewed tea from foxglove. Heart stopped faster than a panicked hare. Since then, you've been careful. You even hum a little rhyme. Red or white, it's poison outright. Not foolproof, but better than blind luck. You check the base of a wall and find sorrel. Tangy, lemony, perfect for cutting the blandness of barley stew. You chew a leaf, sharp, bright, alive, like biting into spring. You grin. Your basket's filling up. You're basically a medieval grocery cart with knees. By a stream you find watercress, clean, crisp, and delicious, assuming no one upstream let the sheep wade in. You rinse it anyway because optimism is a muscle worth flexing. You even find a small patch of wild strawberries, tiny red and absurdly sweet. You pop one in your mouth. It tastes like cheating. Like nature briefly forgot this was the Middle Ages and gave you dessert. Foraging isn't just about food, it's about rhythm. You start to recognize how the seasons breathe when the nettles rise, when the berries swell, when the mushrooms dare to peak. You stop seeing weeds and start seeing opportunity. And snacks. You pluck some elderflowers and bundle them carefully. Dried, they'll become a tea that soothes colds and makes winter feel less cruel. In a few months, they'll turn into dark purple berries you can cook into syrup or mash into something strong enough to make you forget your cold. You find a patch of purslane near the edge of the road. Slimy, crunchy, full of omega-3s. Not that you know what that means, but you can feel your joint celebrating. You collect it with the smug satisfaction of a person who's just found an unguarded pantry. Foraging doesn't just feed you, it gives you something else. Agency. When the crops fail, when the cellar's low, when your neighbor borrows your last turnip and swears he thought it was his, these greens, nuts, and roots are a small rebellion, a quiet triumph. You pass a tree with bark stripped at the base, a sign of deer, or desperate villagers looking for inner bark to dry and grind into famine flour. You've never gone that far, but you've heard the stories. Bark bread, the last step before true hunger. You shake your head. Not today. Your basket is full, your belly is hopeful, and tonight's dinner will have flavor. Maybe even variety. That's more than most. The chickens cluck as you return. You hold up your prize. They remain unimpressed. You suspect if they had arms, they'd cross them. You wash your hands in the cold bucket by the door, your fingers tingling. Another day, another patch of green salvation. No fridge, no freezer, no delivery app. Just you, your knife, and a decent working knowledge of what won't kill you. And for now, that's enough. Your basket of greens rests by the hearth, and outside the wind has picked up, carrying the scent of sheep, smoke, and something vaguely damp, probably you. You brush stray leaves from your tunic and turn your attention to another critical matter of medieval survival, preserving what you've foraged, hunted, or begged from neighbors before it all rots into mush or mold. Because in a world with no refrigerators, no Tupperware, and not even a good Ziploc bag in sight, keeping food edible wasn't just a chore, it was an art form. A desperate, salty, smoky art form. Mainstream historical fact. Medieval people used a variety of methods to preserve food, including drying, salting, smoking, pickling, fermenting, and burying in cool, dark places. These techniques kept food viable through harsh winters, failed harvests, and those awkward times when your pig inconveniently died before you were ready to eat it. You glance at the leg of pork hanging from a hook above the hearth. It's salted so thoroughly that it's basically cured despair. The outer layer is tough, dark, and crusted with age, but inside, meat, glorious, chewy, faintly smoky meat. It's not exactly juicy, but it's not spoiled either, which is all that really matters. You carve off a sliver, chew, and feel your jaw do a full workout. Salt preservation is one of the oldest tricks in the book. You cover meat or fish with an absurd amount of salt, sometimes mixing it with ashes, herbs, or even crushed dried kelp, and let it dry out over days or weeks. The salt pulls out moisture, and in doing so, denies bacteria their happy little paradise. Of course, the downside is that everything starts tasting like a salt lick. You drink more ale, you accept it, you move on. Quirky fact. In parts of Scandinavia, they used to bury fish and let it ferment underground into a delicacy called surströmming, which still exists today, still stinks like an alchemist's failed experiment, and still allegedly tastes better than it smells, which isn't saying much. In your own kitchen, you're partial to drying herbs and greens. You string wild garlic and nettles upside down near the fire until they crinkle and rattle like old parchment. Crushed into soup, they add a whisper of flavor. Herbal ASMR for your tongue. You also use the bury it in the cellar method. It's not glamorous, but a pit dug into the earth, lined with straw or clay, keeps root vegetables like turnips, carrots, and onions cool enough to survive the weeks. You wrap apples in straw too, stack them in crates, and check them obsessively for rot. One bad apple really does spoil the bunch. You've seen it happen. It's like a fungal apocalypse down there. Historians still argue whether medieval ice houses and cold storage pits were widespread among common folk or more of a luxury enjoyed by monasteries and estates. Some argue that even peasants had clever underground systems. Others believe they mostly relied on timing, luck, and quick consumption. You, personally, trust your cold corner and an ominous sense of smell. If something stinks like bad magic, you don't eat it. That's the rule. There's also the smokehouse. You don't have one yourself, but your cousin does. A little shed near his croft, walls stained black with soot, where meat hangs from wooden beams and absorbs every puff of oak and alder. The meat dries slowly, protected by the smoke, until it's tough enough to need a knife and patience. It's preserved. It's strong. It's borderline weaponized jerky. Once he smoked a batch of eels. You didn't even know you liked eels until that moment. Smoky, oily, chewy eels, wrapped in bread and eaten by candlelight like some medieval delicacy. You still dream about them. And then there's pickling. You crouch by your barrel, pull back the lid, and peer into the brine. Floating inside, onions, garlic, turnips, and a few suspicious cucumbers. They smell sharp, sour, and oddly appealing. Vinegar is precious stuff often made by fermenting leftover ale or wine until it turns tart enough to kill a cold, or at least make you forget it. Pickled vegetables are your winter salvation. When the fresh food is gone, when snow blankets the village, and your only options are boiled grain or chewing the furniture, you open the barrel and eat color. The crunch of a pickled carrot is, frankly, the closest you've come to joy in February. Fermentation is another trick. You've got a crock of sour cabbage bubbling gently by the fire. Sauerkraut, but make it medieval. The cabbage ferments in its own juices, helped along by salt and thyme. The result? Something tangy, strong, and suspiciously good for your digestion. Not that you understand digestion, but you've noticed fewer incidents since eating it regularly. You even dabble in cheese making. Soft cheeses are easiest. Curdle warm milk with a splash of vinegar, press the curds, and salt the heck out of them. Wrap in cloth, store in a cool spot, and pray. If it doesn't sprout a second life form, you call it edible. If it does, you call it experimental. For sweet things, you preserve fruit as pastes or syrups. You boil apples down until they surrender, mix them with honey, and let the thick, sticky mess set in a jar. It'll last for weeks, months even, if no one dips in with a filthy spoon. You mark the good jars with a charcoal X. You don't always remember why, but it feels important. You recall one memorable failure: pickled walnuts. They looked like tiny brains in brine and tasted like wet regret. You tried to pass them off as a delicacy. No one believed you. Preservation isn't just practical, it's cultural. Entire festivals revolve around food that's been cured, smoked, or sweetened into submission. In the coldest months, neighbors trade jars of jam for salted pork, dried herbs for sour ale. It's barter and bragging rights all at once. You light the fire again and check the drying rack above it. A few mushrooms, a ring of onions, strips of salted rabbit jerky. You flip one and sniff. Still smells like meat, not mildew. A good sign. Everything here is a gamble. Will it last? Will it spoil? Will it give you a night of fever dreams and regret? But most of the time, you win. And that's the magic. You've bent time, just a little. Trapped flavor in a jar, smoke, salt, or pot. You've kept hunger at bay by turning science into habit, craft into instinct, no fridge required. Tomorrow, maybe, you'll try drying apples or smoking fish, or that thing your neighbor swears keeps eggs fresh in lime water for 6 months. You're not sure you believe him, but stranger things have fermented in your pantry. For now, you seal the pickle jar, stoke the fire, and admire your little empire of edible time capsules. The wind outside is howling like a medieval banshee, and you huddle near the hearth, hunched over your favorite battered wooden bowl. Inside, something warm simmers, barley, a slice of onion, maybe a chunk of last week's dried turnip. This, right here, is the centerpiece of medieval dining, the humble, ever-changing, endlessly recycled pottage. Welcome to the world of stews and soups, the backbone of daily medieval life, the edible cauldron of hopes, scraps, and culinary guesswork. It's not flashy, it's rarely photogenic, but it keeps you alive. Most of the time. Mainstream historical fact. Pottage was the staple food for medieval peasants and even many townsfolk across Europe. It was a thick stew made from grains, legumes, root vegetables, and whatever bits of meat or greens were available, kept warm over the fire and replenished throughout the day as ingredients allowed. You lift your spoon and blow gently. The steam carries notes of leek, maybe parsley. Definitely yesterday's cabbage. It's a living stew, literally. You never fully empty the pot. Instead, you keep adding things to it. Today a carrot, tomorrow some beans. Friday, if you're lucky, a ham bone. Think of it like sourdough starter, but soupier and with fewer Instagram influencers. There's even a phrase for this, perpetual stew. A cauldron that never fully empties, its flavor deepening with time. Some families claim their pottage has been simmering for weeks, others months. You suspect your cousin once kept one going for half a year, though at some point it started to taste more like boot than broth. You dip your spoon again and get a chunk of something chewy. Barley? Maybe. Possibly a leftover bit of yesterday's bread that got tossed in. You chew it anyway, it's fuel, and shockingly comforting. Quirky fact. Some monasteries flavored their pottage with beer or mead instead of water for a richer broth. And let's be honest, because beer-flavored cabbage is at least mildly distracting from cabbage-flavored cabbage. You remember helping your neighbor make a Friday pottage. No meat, of course. Meat's a sin on Fridays, unless you're nobility, and can argue that swan counts as fish. Instead, you loaded the pot with peas, onion, a little wild garlic, and a chunk of stale cheese rained to the point of violence. After hours of simmering, it became creamy, savory, and weirdly addictive. Monks would have approved, possibly with vows of silence and quiet slurping. Historians still argue whether pottage recipes were passed down formally or evolved naturally through repetition and scarcity. Some suggest every region had its own unwritten rules. Others argue it was a glorious free-for-all of edible improvisation and desperate pantry raids. Your own approach? Whatever's not moldy, throw it in. A little ale to loosen the bottom of the pot. A pinch of salt when you can spare it. Herbs when they're in season. And bread. Always bread. Crumbled, dunked, or fried hard, and floated like an island of crust. Tonight's pottage also has lentils. a gift from the traveling friar who stayed in your barn last week. He traded you 3 scoops for 2 eggs and a woolen mitten. You call that a win. Lentils soak up flavor like gossip and keep your belly feeling full. He also told you they help with internal winds, which may explain why he traveled alone. You remember once finding a chicken foot in your bowl. Not exactly appetizing, but it added collagen, which is modern speak for why does this soup jiggle when cold? The foot had been boiled until soft, the nails curling in like they'd heard something scandalous. Pottage varies with the seasons. In spring, it's lighter, wild herbs, young onions, and soft peas. In summer, you get carrots, parsnips, maybe even a rogue chunk of pork if your neighbor's pig got unlucky. Autumn is the golden age. Squash, beans, dried mushrooms, and that one time someone brought chestnuts. Winter? Winter's where the real alchemy happens. Fermented cabbage, pickled turnip, stale rye bread thick enough to slow time. There are tricks, too. You learn that browned onions give sweetness, that soaking dried beans overnight saves your teeth, that a splash of vinegar can make everything taste just a bit brighter. You never call it umami because that word won't exist for centuries, but you feel it deep in your molars. You once tried to fancy things up by thickening your stew with egg yolk and saffron. It worked, sort of. It also turned the whole pot a violently golden color and earned you the nickname Sunshine Soup for a month. Worth it. Some nobles, bored with peasant pottage, took the idea and twisted it. They called it broth and added almonds, spices, and tiny dumplings shaped like birds or fruit. You tried a version once, cooked by a merchant's wife. It was delicate, perfumed, and almost too pretty to eat. You ate it anyway with a spoon so small it felt like a prank. But you're loyal to the thick stuff. Pottage doesn't judge. It forgives bad days and bad ingredients. It grows stronger with time, like good friends and regrettable nicknames. You share it often, when neighbors come by, when workers finish threshing grain, when a stranger knocks looking for warmth. Everyone eats from the same pot, dipping bread or wooden spoons, adding a pinch of something if they can spare it. You've even seen arguments paused mid-fight so someone can go back for seconds. Tonight, your pottage is mellow. The flavors have married. They might not be happily married, but at least they're cohabiting peacefully. You scoop another spoonful, let the warmth slide down, and close your eyes. Outside, the wind whistles. Inside, you're full. And maybe that's what medieval comfort food really means. Not excitement, not elegance, just warmth, sustenance, and the comforting thud of something thick enough to stand your spoon in. Tomorrow, you'll add a turnip, or a handful of beans, or that questionable leek you found behind the flour sack. The stew will adapt. It always does. That's the magic of pottage. It's not just food, it's a reflection of your life. Resilient, practical, full of surprises, and sometimes a little weird. The pot itself is part of the tradition. Big, blackened, cracked just enough to whisper stories. You keep it over the fire all day, nudging it back when the flames die down. Sometimes you forget it, and it scorches the bottom, creating a crust so charred it might legally count as coal. But you scrape it off and keep going. Because when every morsel counts, there's no such thing as burnt, just extra flavorful. Every so often, someone in the village gets bold and tries a clear broth, usually because they're sick and can't handle real food. You remember the last time that happened, your neighbor simmered chicken bones, garlic, and herbs until the liquid shimmered like gold. It smelled so good that 3 other families suddenly got sick, too. Coincidence? Still, for all its variety, pottage stays humble. It doesn't judge. It feeds the rich and the poor, the monk and the thief. It's shared in joy and grief, over births and funerals, harvests and famines. It's a thread that runs through every day, tying the mundane to the sacred in spoonfuls of warmth. So you rise from your bench, set the lid gently on the pot, and whisper a promise to tomorrow. There'll be something in here worth eating. And if not, well, there's always stale bread. Bubbles quietly, still alive in its own sleepy way. A potion brewed not by sorcerers but by everyday folks like you, with muddy boots and smoke-streaked aprons, wielding ladles instead of wands. You give it a final stir and turn your thoughts to something a bit sweeter. No, not romance. Those only end in plague or awkward marriages by 14. We're talking medieval sweets, the rare but glorious rewards for surviving the salt and barley marathon of daily life. Because, yes, people in the Middle Ages had a sweet tooth. They just had to be more creative, more patient, and often wealthier than you to satisfy it. Mainstream historical fact. Sugar was known in medieval Europe, but remained a rare, expensive luxury until the late Middle Ages. For most people, sweetening came from honey, dried fruits, and sweet wine reductions. You dip your fingers into a little jar of honey, saved carefully from the last swarm you bribed away from your rafters. It's thick, golden, and sticky in that way that makes you immediately want to lick your own elbow. This is your treasure, your mood booster, your I survived another Tuesday reward. You drizzle it over a piece of rye bread, just enough to give the crust a shimmer. This is dessert, and it's glorious. The upper crust, of course, have more elaborate options. They import sugar loaves, which look like strange white cones, often so hard you have to chip off bits with a special hammer. Because when you're rich, even your desserts require tools. You once saw a noblewoman eat candied fennel seeds, bright green, crunchy, and smelling faintly of licorice. They served them on silver platters between courses, like breath mints with delusions of grandeur. You thought they tasted like cough syrup, but no one asked you. Your own sweets tend to come from the woods and the orchard. Dried apples, raisins, figs if you're lucky, and someone passed through a port town. You stew them with a bit of wine or ale, maybe cinnamon if you can steal a pinch from the church pantry. It all reduces down into a jammy, gooey mess you can smear on bread or just eat with your fingers when no one's looking. Quirky fact. In some areas, hedgehogs were roasted and glazed with honey as a festive dish. No, you don't want to think about how they removed the spines. Yes, someone definitely chipped a tooth. You once tried making frumenti, a holiday dish of boiled wheat, milk, and sweeteners, sort of a medieval rice pudding, but with more cow. If you stir it long enough and don't burn the bottom, you always burn the bottom, it becomes this rich, creamy porridge. You added dried currants once, and suddenly it felt fancy. You even gave it a name, golden porridge, which made your siblings roll their eyes. There are fritters, too, deep-fried dough sweetened with honey and dusted with spice. A festival treat, usually made when the oil is fresh, which is never. You remember getting one from a traveling tinker's cart, piping hot, soaked in sticky syrup. It scalded your tongue and gave you joy for the rest of the week. Your friend dropped hers in the mud and cried like someone had stepped on a kitten. But the pinnacle of medieval sweet-making, subtleties, sculpted sugar creatures, dragons, swans, castles, served between courses in noble feasts. Not really for eating, more for showing off that you could afford sugar and idle hands. Historians still argue whether these were eaten at all or just admired, then fed to servants or tossed to dogs. You imagine biting into a tiny sugar knight. Crunchy. You've even experimented with a poor person's sweetmeat, roasted nuts glazed in honey and rolled in crushed seeds. You call it chewy joy, others call it tooth danger. It's both. You dream sometimes of marzipan, the almond sugar paste whispered about in towns with spice markets. Soft, sculptable, delicious. You've never tasted it, but once a traveling peddler let you sniff a piece. It smelled like something from the Fey realm, sweet, rich, and not at all what a turnip smells like. And then there's mead, fermented honey wine. You sip it on cold nights or after a harvest celebration when the fire's low and your feet ache. It's both dessert and drink, sweet, slightly sharp, and warm all the way down. Your uncle makes his with crab apples and juniper. It tastes like someone pickled the moon. But you drink it anyway. Sometimes, when times are hard, you roast a carrot slowly in the ashes, peel off the skin, and eat it like candy. If it's a good carrot, and you squint hard enough, it almost tastes like honey. Almost. You know where the village bees nest. You leave offerings by the hive, herbs, bits of fruit, just in case. Because honey is life. It keeps indefinitely, it heals wounds, it sweetens porridge. You once heard it could even preserve bodies. Someone said Alexander the Great was buried in a honey bath. You're not sure that's true, but it's sticky enough to feel believable. When you're feeling particularly brave, you try your hand at fruit leather. You mash berries and apples together, spread the pulp on a cloth, and leave it near the fire until it dries into something tough, bendable, and vaguely sweet. You chew it like jerky. Kids love it, so do you if it hasn't picked up too much soot. Tonight, you take the last of your stewed pears, cooked slowly in red wine, cloves, and honey, and eat them slowly by the fire. The spices cling to your tongue, the wine warms your throat, and the fruit melts like something from a nobleman's dream. This is your moment of indulgence, your sweetness, carved out of a world full of sour. You look at your empty bowl and sigh contentedly. Sweet things may be rare, but that's what makes them magical. They're moments of joy, fleeting and precious, like sunlight through stained glass or a warm breeze in March. Tomorrow you go back to barley and broth, but tonight you gotta taste sugar without a spoonful of privilege. You earned it. Will taste different, richer, a little earthier, thanks to that turnip. Maybe even better if that leek doesn't try to poison you. The pottage waits, patient and ever hungry, as you shift your focus to the sweeter things in life, however rare, however sticky. So let's talk about treats, not the daily bowl of gruel that warms your stomach, but the glimmers of joy that tickle your tongue. The ones you save for holidays, weddings, or when someone miraculously doesn't die from falling into the well. Because sweets in the medieval world are like miracles, uncommon, briefly wonderful, and usually surrounded by clergy. Your go-to sweetener, of course, is honey, golden, gooey, and weirdly immortal. You once found a bit hidden in a cracked jug beneath your aunt's floorboards. No one knows how old it was, possibly ancient. You ate it anyway, still delicious, possibly cursed. Mainstream historical fact. Honey was the dominant sweetener across medieval Europe for most of the period. It was easier to obtain than expensive imported sugar and was used in everything from cakes to sauces to medicine. You spoon out a dollop and lick your finger. It's floral, intense, a little wild, like the bees that made it. Bees were both beloved and feared in medieval life. You had to tell the bees when someone died or they might leave the hive in protest. You tried it once, whispered to a bee about your cousin's wedding. It just buzzed off like it had better things to do. You've heard whispers of sugar, bright white cones from the east, chopped with knives and prize-like treasure. You've never seen it, except once in a noble's pantry during a delivery job. Looked like a tiny wizard's tower. You were told not to touch it. You touched it anyway. It tasted fine, but honestly, you prefer honey. Dried fruits are a treat too. Figs from markets, raisins from the last of the grape harvest, plums dried into chewy black mystery snacks. You once got your hands on some dates, ate them too fast, and got a stomachache. Worth it. For something more substantial, there's frumenti. Remember that? Wheat boiled with milk or broth, thickened until creamy, then sweetened with honey or dried fruit. It's festive, a winter favorite. You once tried making it fancy by grating nutmeg into it, and your brother told everyone you'd become a wizard. Quirky fact. In medieval feasts, sweets weren't just for dessert. Often, sweet and savory flavors were mixed. You might get chicken stewed with prunes or beef glazed in cinnamon honey sauce. Confusing, but oddly satisfying. But if you were really lucky or connected, you might get invited to a feast with subtleties, not emotions. Sugar sculptures, castles, swans, mythical beasts, all molded out of sweetened almond paste or hardened sugar. They weren't always meant to be eaten, but someone always tried. One boy lost a tooth biting a sugar griffin, never lived it down. Historians still argue whether subtleties were mostly edible art or just edible status symbols. Were they about flavor or spectacle? Were they shared or just paraded and tossed? Either way, you weren't invited. Back in your reality, sweets tend to be more invented in desperation. One of your favorites? Roasting crab apples until their tartness fades and they melt on the tongue. If you toss them in a little ale or honey, they get downright poetic. You once made a batch so good, you wrote a song about it. The song had 4 words. They were all yes. You've also made your own medieval fruit leather, mash of overripe pears and blackberries, spread thin on cloth and left near the hearth until it becomes a chewy sheet of joy. You roll it up and chew on it like a secret. Then there's fried dough, flour, water, maybe an egg if you're rich that week, fried in leftover fat, then soaked in honey. Your fingers get sticky for days, but who cares? You'd eat 20 if someone let you. No one lets you. For drinks, sweetened wine is the medieval milkshake, spiced, mulled, and ladled into cracked mugs. You once drank mulled wine with cinnamon, clove, and orange peel and thought you'd briefly ascended to heaven. Then it burned going down, and you remembered you still lived in a drafty hut. Monks make mead, honey wine. You sip it slowly, warm and golden, and feel like a bard in a very cozy dream. Your uncle brews a batch with wild herbs that makes your nose run, and your vision blur. You like it anyway. And for all the simplicity, there's something magical in how sweet things bring people together. A shared fig can end a fight. A stolen raisin can start one. Honey cakes mark holidays, birthdays, and rare moments when the chickens all lay on the same day. You once helped a widow bake spiced gingerbread for a feast day, not like modern gingerbread, no cute men with icing smiles. This stuff was tough, baked hard as roof tiles, flavored with real ginger, pepper, and honey. You nearly cracked a tooth, but loved every crumb. That's medieval love, complicated, spicy, and just a little painful. There's a thrill in the rarity. Sweetness isn't guaranteed. It doesn't arrive on a truck every Tuesday. It's hunted, hoarded, saved, and celebrated. It's the reward at the end of harvest. The spoonful that says, you did it, you're still here. You pull your rough wool blanket tighter and look at your last sweet, just a wrinkled fig, soft and dark and impossibly rich. You bite in. It's syrupy inside, seeds crunching like whispers. You don't get this every day, but maybe that's the point. While that fig melts on your tongue like a dream soaked in summer, you start to think about what happens when food goes bad, or rather, what medieval people did to stop it from turning into a smelly science experiment in a clay bowl. Because, let's be real, no fridges, no freezers, no Best Buy stickers, just time, air, and the ever-present march of bacteria with no respect for your pantry. You open the lid to your larder, and the garlic looks angry. The onions are growing suspicious green hair. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where food storage was a skill, a gamble, and sometimes an extreme sport. Mainstream historical fact, without refrigeration, medieval people relied on techniques like salting, drying, smoking, fermenting, pickling, and storing food in cool, dark cellars to prolong shelf life. Your first line of defense, salt. Salt is king. Salt is life. Salt is currency. You use it to preserve meat, fish, and even some vegetables. A haunch of pork buried in salt for weeks will emerge tough, dry, and safe to eat long after it should be walking on its own again. You soak it before cooking to reduce the saltiness, or, if you're in a hurry, just chew through the salt like a very determined goat. You've got barrels of fish packed in layers of salt down by the stream. The smell is something between ocean breeze and regret. But it works. Even months later, those fish are edible. Sort of. Your uncle says if it doesn't kill you, it's dinner. Next comes drying. Hang meat, herbs, mushrooms, fruit, anything really, near the hearth or on the rafters. It shrivels, darkens, and loses all its juiciness, but it lasts. Dried apples are chewy and sweet. Dried meat becomes jerky so tough you could patch boots with it. Still edible, though, eventually. Smoking is the romantic cousin of drying. You build a smoky fire, hang your meat in the rafters or a smokehouse, and let the flavor seep in. It smells like a bonfire dream. That smoky ham from Michaelmas, you still think about it. Sweet, savory, and smoky enough to haunt your dreams like a friendly ghost. Quirky fact, some people smoked cheese, which both preserved it and gave it a flavor somewhere between delicious and burnt barn. Fermentation is the alchemy of your time. You leave cabbage in brine, and instead of rotting, it becomes tangy, crunchy sauerkraut. You don't question it. You just eat it and nod respectfully. You make small beer, barely alcoholic, low in bacteria, and safer than most well water. The trick is not to think about the cloudy bits. You've even tasted garum, fermented fish sauce used in older Roman recipes and still lurking in some medieval kitchens near the coast. It smells like betrayal, but adds a punch of umami to otherwise bland grains. Your friend swears by it. You swear at it. Historians still argue whether people fully understood the science of fermentation or just followed the magic of, if it doesn't kill you, serve it again. Whatever the case, it worked. Pickling is another miracle. Vinegar and salt do things water can't. You pickle turnips, cucumbers, onions, whatever you can't finish today. It comes out tart, briny, and oddly crunchy. You once bit into a pickled egg and nearly cried. Tears of joy, hard to say. Could have been the vinegar fumes. In winter, you dig out your root cellar, a dark, cool, slightly damp hole under the house, and pull out carrots, parsnips, and beets stored in sand. They're soft, a little wilted, but very much edible. As long as the rats didn't get in, the rats always try to get in. Cheese, of course, is its own journey. Fresh cheese spoils fast. But aged cheese, left in cool storage, hardens into something long-lasting and robust. Sometimes too robust. You once sliced a wheel that smelled so strong the dog left the house voluntarily. Butter is preserved as well by burying it in jars, salting it, or if you're Irish, submerging it in bogs. Yes, really. Bog butter, creamy, salty, and probably haunted. Grain, the backbone of life, has to be kept dry and rodent-free. You store it in sacks, hang it from the rafters, even seal it in pottery jars. One year, your gran tried sealing some with beeswax. It worked, until someone mistook it for a candle. When everything else fails, you eat it fast. No leftovers unless you're sure. And sometimes the best method of preservation is turning it into something else. That milk, make cheese. That fruit, make jam. Those vegetables, make soup. You live in a world where transformation is survival. Some food you leave out on purpose, like sourdough starter. It's alive, bubbling, growing, breathing. You feed it flour and water, and it rewards you with bread that rises like a miracle. You once forgot about it for a week, came back to find it had taken over the corner of your kitchen, named it Gerald. Still use it. Sometimes food preservation gets a little odd. You heard of a village that wrapped meat in moss and buried it in cold earth, claimed it tasted earthy. More likely it tasted like moss. But hey, when meat is rare, you get creative. And there's always the old test. Does it smell okay? Is it fuzzy? Did it just move? These are the rules. You play fast and loose with the concept of expiration. You check your pottage one last time. Still bubbling, still vaguely edible. And tomorrow, you'll toss in some salted pork and maybe a dried apple slice. Sweet and savory. Preserved and fresh. Past and present in one humble bowl. And if you're lucky, nothing you eat this week will try to kill you. You fall asleep that night full of warm pottage and vinegar dreams, only to wake up to the cheerful clatter of market morning. It's the one day a week when your world blooms. If blooming means jostling elbows, hollering fishwives, and that one pig that always escapes and barrels through someone's turnip cart, because today you're headed to the medieval market, a chaotic symphony of barter, gossip, suspicious smells, and very loud cheese. Mainstream historical fact. Medieval markets were crucial hubs of trade and community, often regulated by local authorities and bustling with vendors, selling everything from food to textiles. You duck under the wooden sign swinging from rusty hinges, 2 crudely painted apples, one with a worm. You pass through the gates and into the crowd. which smells like sweat, smoked meat, and hope. Everything's for sale if you squint hard enough. Baskets overflow with cabbages and onions, their roots still dusty. Apples are waxy red and green, their bruises hidden on the bottom. You see fresh herbs bundled with twine, sage, thyme, maybe a stray caterpillar or two hitching a ride. And bread. Ah, the bread. Dense barley loaves, squat and hard enough to defend a small fortress. A baker shouts over the din, offering yesterday's batch at half price. You know that trick. It's been yesterday's for 3 days. Quirky tidbit. Some bread sellers used ground-up peas, beans, or even chalk to stretch their flour. You once bit into a loaf so dry you thought you'd chipped a tooth. Turned out it was just a pebble, bonus mineral. You see smoked eels strung like garlands from a vendor's pole. They glisten in the sun like slippery wind chimes. Your stomach turns and growls in disagreement. Nearby, a woman fans away flies from a basket of soft white cheese, the kind that lasts just long enough to smell suspicious. She insists it's fresh. Her nose twitches. You decide to believe her. A merchant with a crooked grin offers pickled things in jars, cucumbers, onions, garlic, maybe 1 or 2 mystery objects. He gives you a sample on the tip of a knife. You gag. He winks. You still buy a jar. For later, for revenge. You're here partly to trade. You've brought a small pouch of dried mushrooms, a few eggs, and a woven cord your cousin made during a fit of unexpected craftsmanship. You manage to swap it all for a clutch of herbs, a lump of butter wrapped in cabbage leaves, and 1 suspiciously green apple. Not bad, considering the butter's not moving. Historians still argue whether medieval markets were truly open to all, or heavily tilted toward the wealthy and well-connected. You'd argue both. Technically, anyone can trade. Realistically, you get more with coin, or gossip, or blackmail, whatever works. Spices? Rare, exotic, and hilariously expensive. You find a man hawking what he claims is saffron. You squint at the dusty pile. It's marigold petals. You call him on it. He shrugs and throws in a pinch of real cinnamon. You feel like royalty. The market is also where food mingles with entertainment. A man balances on a barrel, juggling pears. A child tries to swipe one and gets clobbered with a leak. A puppet show nearby reenacts The Cheese That Ate a Man, which is apparently based on a true story. You stop at the ale cart. It's lukewarm and slightly sour. You drink it anyway. The brewer is also selling something new. He calls it Honey Fizz. It's slightly fermented mead with bubbles. You take a sip and belch like a medieval trumpet. The brewer grins. That'll be a halfpenny. You see dried sausages hung on a rack like trophies, fat, coiled, and dark with spice. You'd do questionable things for a bite of that sausage. Instead, you do the honorable thing, compliment the vendor's hat, and wait for a sample. It works. You chew in slow, greasy bliss. You spy the fishmonger. He's yelling about the freshest carp this side of the river. The carp in question is stiff, classy-eyed, and may have witnessed the founding of your village. You pass. There are treats, too. Gingerbread slabs, spiced and sticky, peddled by a woman with a face like a lemon. Bite it and weep, she says. You do, you do. The burn of the ginger lights up your brain like a church bell. You buy 3. Someone's selling roasted nuts coated in honey. You're not sure what kind of nuts they are, you ask. Forest nuts, the vendor says. You nod like that explains everything. You eat them until your fingers glue together. Then come the street cooks, the beating heart of market appetite. One is frying onions and pork fat together in a bubbling pan. The smell alone nearly makes you cry. Another has a pot of thick vegetable stew with a wooden spoon worn smooth from years of stirring. You dip your bread in it and sigh so hard someone thinks you're hurt. You catch a whiff of something darker, liver maybe, or some kind of offal. You turn. A cook is frying bits of mystery meat on skewers. You ask what it is. He says, "Don't ask." You pay him. It's delicious. The market pulses with life, food, laughter, arguing. and occasional swearing. It's messy, it's loud, it's wonderfully human. You bump into someone carrying 6 dead chickens like a floral arrangement. You apologize. The chickens do not. And when it's all too much, you retreat to the edge of the square, sit on a warm stone and look at your haul. Butter, herbs, dried sausage, stale gingerbread, and a questionable apple. A feast, really. The market winds down as the sun tilts. Vendors pack up, dogs fight over dropped scraps. The juggler's pears are gone, stolen, or eaten, no one knows. A small boy plays a pipe badly, earning 3 copper coins and a boiled beet. You head home, arms full, stomach happy. The path back smells like trampled grass and leftover onion. You'll eat well tonight, if you can stop nibbling before you even reach your door. And next week, you'll come earlier, you'll bring better trade. And maybe, just maybe, you'll finally get that smoked eel. Or not. Some dreams are best left uneaten. Back from the market with your satchel of treasure, some edible, some probably cursed, you tiptoe into the kitchen with the reverence of someone carrying an egg, balanced on a spoon. Because today, you're not just eating, you're cooking. And in the Middle Ages, that's a full-body experience. Cooking isn't just something you do before dinner. It is dinner and lunch and breakfast. And if you do it wrong, possibly your funeral. Mainstream historical fact. In medieval households, cooking was typically done over an open hearth with pots suspended by chains or tripods and recipes based more on tradition and touch than measurements. You kneel by the hearth, the embers still warm from the morning fire. You add kindling, whisper something vaguely threatening to the logs, and strike your flint like you mean it. Eventually, flames curl up and lick the blackened stones. Success. You've now completed step 1 of not starving. Your fire doesn't just heat your food. It's your stove, your oven, your toaster, and your mood lighting. You hang your iron pot from a chain that groans like an old monk, and you plop in water fetched from the stream, which you hope is clearer than the last time. Today's goal, a barley and vegetable pottage. Barley's the base, cheap, filling, and has the same texture whether it's overcooked or not. You toss in chopped onions, bits of cabbage, and a carrot so gnarled it looks like it fought in a crusade. Quirky tidbit. Medieval cooks often flavored stews with a bundle of herbs tied with string and tossed into the pot, a precursor to the modern bouquet garni. Some included unexpected additions like marigold petals or even a splash of vinegar-soaked bread for tang. You stir with a wooden spoon the size of a canoe paddle. Stirring is an art. You have to rotate through the stew gently, like coaxing a dragon to nap. If it burns, the bottom layer turns into blackened resentment, and no one will ever let you forget it. Spices? If you're lucky, you have a pinch of pepper or a hint of saffron hoarded from a cousin who once flirted with a spice merchant. Otherwise, you fake it. Ground mustard seeds, wild garlic, or dried horseradish do the trick. The goal isn't subtlety, it's survival with flavor. Historians still argue whether most peasants had regular access to spices, or if that's just upper-class kitchen fantasy. What's clear is that when someone gets their hands on cloves, they use them, sometimes a bit too enthusiastically. One village feast turned into a mouth-numbing clove fest that left people drooling for days. You reach for your herbs, sage, thyme, and maybe a few sprigs of nettle if you're feeling daring. Yes, nettle. Cooked properly, it's nutritious and tame. Cooked improperly, it's like chewing a hedgehog. Sometimes you thicken the stew with a bit of coarse ground bread, especially if yesterday's loaf could now be legally classified as a brick. That's the beauty of medieval cooking. Nothing goes to waste. Stale bread becomes thickener, sour milk becomes cheese, and oops becomes a special recipe. You decide to add a smoked sausage, just a slice or two for flavor. You drop it into the bubbling mix, and it perfumes the pot with promise. Your stomach responds with a noise like a disgruntled goose. You've got no clocks. You cook by smell, texture, and guesswork. If it smells ready and looks like stew, it probably is. You taste with your finger, burning your tongue in the process. It's tradition. And now for the side dish. Manchet bread. This one's fancy. White wheat flour, a bit of yeast from yesterday's ale, salt, and water. You knead the dough on a wooden board, folding and punching it like it owes you money. Then you leave it by the fire to rise while you mutter prayers and side-eye it into compliance. When it's time to bake, you've got options: flat stones near the fire, a covered pot set among embers, or a communal oven in the village. Today you're brave. You place it under your inverted pot oven, piling hot embers on top like a volcanic hat. It bakes slowly, the air filling with that yeasty, comforting smell that even your grumpy neighbor can't resist. By now the stew is rich and thick. You skim off the scum, yes, scum, it's a real medieval thing, and give it one last stir. The sausage has melted into the broth, the vegetables are soft, and the barley has expanded like it's showing off. You ladle it into a wooden bowl. Ceramics are nice but expensive, and besides, wood doesn't crack when it's hot. You tear off a chunk of bread that miraculously baked golden, though one corner is suspiciously blackened. You decide to call it artisan crust, and because you're feeling luxurious, you drizzle a few drops of oil over the stew. Not olive, too expensive, but maybe hemp seed oil, or even a spoonful of rendered animal fat. It shimmers on top like a crown on soup royalty. Dinner is served. You sit near the fire, bowl in hand, spoon in the other, and take that first bite. The barley is soft and slightly chewy. The broth tastes like the best parts of the market. The sausage is smoky. The herbs sing in their own dusty rustic choir. You lean back against the wall, watching the flames flicker. Your mouth is full. Your hands are warm, and your stomach is quiet for once. You've cooked. You've conquered. Tomorrow you'll scrape out the pot, bake another loaf, maybe stew some beans with nettles and garlic, or maybe just repeat today. It's good enough to do twice. And you think, if this is what a good day tastes like, maybe you're doing all right. You wake up to the sound of chickens muttering darkly at the sunrise, and a faint smell of something smoky wafting from the ashes of yesterday's fire. Your belly feels surprisingly full for once, and you stretch with the lazy satisfaction of someone who didn't go to bed gnawing on regrets and stale barley. But the food's not going to feed itself. And while yesterday was all about fire and stew and coaxing flavor from barley, today's challenge is preservation. Because in this medieval world, unless you want to cook every single day, and let's be honest, sometimes you really don't, you need to master the delicate, funky, and sometimes terrifying art of keeping food from turning into a moldy science project. Mainstream historical fact. Medieval people used a variety of preservation techniques to make food last without refrigeration. Salting, smoking, drying, pickling, and fermenting were all common and vital to survival. You start in the pantry, or more accurately, the coolest corner of your home where the sun doesn't shine, the rats fear to tread, and your cousin once swore he saw a ghost. It smells like onions, old wood, and a hint of vinegar. Honestly, it's comforting. First up, salting. Salt is your best friend and your greatest expense. It doesn't just flavor your food, it mummifies it. You've got a small barrel of salted pork that's been soaking in a briny bath for weeks now. You pry off the lid and get a whiff of something sharp and meaty. It's a smell you've grown used to, though newcomers often react by gagging or fainting. The meat is hard, salty, and tough as boiled leather, but boiled long enough it becomes tender and edible, mostly. Quirky tidbit. Some medieval households kept saltfish so long it practically became legendary. There is a story of a dried cod nicknamed Sir Thomas that hung from a beam for 5 years before anyone dared cook it. It reportedly tasted like hope and furniture. You've also got some dried beans and peas strung up in linen sacks. These are the unsung heroes of medieval food storage. They last through the winter, don't complain, and only require half a day of soaking before they admit defeat. Hanging beside them are bundles of herbs, some culinary, some medicinal, some you honestly forget the purpose of. One might cure headaches, Another might make your feet go numb. It's all very exciting. Then there's the smoke stuff. You remember your uncle's smokehouse? Just a little shack with a hole in the roof and a hook to hang meat or fish. Inside, it smells like ancient bacon and damp firewood. You hang sausages, eels, even cheese in there, letting the smoke slowly dry them out and saturate them with flavor. You've still got a few links left from last month's smoking. They're stiff, dark, and slightly oily. You give one a sniff. Still good. Maybe. You nibble. Still edible. You chew harder. Yep, definitely still food. And still argue whether smokehouses were common across all medieval villages or primarily the domain of wealthier households. What's clear is that wherever meat needed saving, someone was building a smoke hole. Then there's pickling, the sour savior of vegetables. You've got a few jars sealed with wax and stored on a shelf. One is filled with cabbage and caraway seeds, another with onions and tiny beet slices. All float in a vinegar brine that could probably strip paint. You pry one open, and the smell punches you right in the nose. It's bright, sharp, and oddly addictive. You spear a pickled beet with a knife tip and crunch down. It tastes like dirt's glamorous cousin. You like it. The vinegar, made from spoiled wine or fermented apple cider, kills off the bad stuff and makes your vegetables last through the cold months. Sometimes too long. You once found a carrot that looked like it had seen the Black Death and come back stronger. Oh, and let's not forget fermenting, that glorious semi-controlled rot that turns milk into cheese, barley into ale, and cabbage into something that makes your breath a weapon. You've got a small round of cheese aging under a cloth. It's crumbly, sharp, and slightly threatening. A moldy edge has crept in, but that's fine. Mostly. You cut it off, pretend it never happened, and move on. You also have a jar of something bubbly. It started life as oat gruel, but now fizzes ominously. You sniff it. It smells alive. You call it sour soup, and serve it only to people who deserve to be surprised. Preserving food is also about storing it right. You keep apples in straw-filled crates, cabbages buried in a pit lined with dry leaves, and your eggs packed in ash to keep them from spoiling. It's all very clever until you forget where you buried the cabbages and dig up a rock instead. There's also the communal oven method. Once a week, everyone in the village cooks their meals in the big stone oven, letting the residual heat bake beans in sealed pots overnight. It's preservation through collaboration, or as your aunt calls it, burn day. Even honey, that magical eternal syrup, gets used to preserve fruit. You've got a tiny pot of honeyed plums that cost you a week's labor to trade for. You guard them like treasure. You let yourself taste one now, just one. It melts on your tongue like sunlight. You swear you hear angels. And of course, the cellar. That chilly, spider-infested chamber under the floorboards where jars, crocks, and sacks rest in the dark. It's not glamorous, but it works. You've got a row of crocks down there, one with fermented cabbage, another with dried apple slices, and one you don't remember filling. You open it. You close it. You put it on the later shelf. Preservation isn't foolproof. Sometimes a batch spoils. Sometimes the rats get in. Sometimes your brother mistakes the salt barrel for the chamber pot. Mistakes were made. You all move on. But when it works, when the cheese is sharp, the sausage rich, the beans hearty, you feel like you've won something, like you've outsmarted the world for just a little longer. You pull your little preserved feast together. A bowl of pickled onions, a wedge of cheese, a slice of smoked sausage, and a hunk of hard bread. It's not hot, it's not fancy, but it's food, it's safe, it's yours, and it'll still be here tomorrow, if you hide it well enough. The rooster hasn't even decided whether to crow yet, but you're already halfway to the edge of the village, clutching a basket and watching your breath fog in the morning air. Why? Because today's menu isn't in your pantry or your cellar or clinging to a hook over the hearth. It's out there, somewhere in the underbrush, hiding behind thorns and pretending it doesn't want to be picked. That's right. Today, you forage. Mainstream historical fact. Foraging was a vital part of the medieval diet, especially for peasants. Wild herbs, fruits, nuts, mushrooms, and greens supplemented the more meager staples of barley and bread, particularly in spring and summer. You duck under a branch and crunch through the frosty grass, eyes scanning for anything edible, and not, well, poisonous. Because while foraging is about survival, it also comes with a hint of danger. And if you've ever eaten a raw elderberry on a dare, you know exactly what kind of danger. But you're not alone. Every villager knows at least a handful of plants worth eating. You spot your first prize quickly: wild garlic. Its sharp, oniony scent hits you before you even see the long, soft green leaves. You pick carefully, twisting instead of yanking to keep the bulbs undisturbed. This stuff goes with everything, from stews to bread, to surprise sauces made of whatever was about to spoil. Just a few steps away, you find chickweed, tiny, delicate, and slightly nutty. Not impressive, but it livens up a salad. That is, if you're in the sort of mood to eat cold leaves and call it a salad. Quirky tidbit. In some places, kids were trained to sing songs about safe versus unsafe plants. One popular rhyme warned, "Red stem is fine, red sap is not. Eat the wrong one, you'll sit and rot." Comforting bedtime stuff, really. As the sun rises and melts the dew, your eyes adjust to the micro-world of edible greens. Dandelion leaves, bitter but bracing. Nettles, tricky but nutritious. You pluck them with a cloth-wrapped hand because, well, they sting. Unless, of course, you enjoy the feeling of your fingers being insulted by nature. You spot a few early mushrooms pushing through the damp soil, and here you pause. Because mushrooms are the roulette of the forest. One might make you feel great. One might make you hallucinate your ancestors doing cartwheels. One might quite simply end you. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly understood the toxicity of certain mushrooms, or just operated on a strict trial and terror basis. Some manuscripts warn against anything white and gilled, others declare those the safest. You squint, reconsider, and leave the mushrooms for braver souls, or at least your cousin who once tried to ferment dandelion wine and still hasn't blinked properly since. Near a thicket, you hit the jackpot, a bramble bush heavy with blackberries. You go in cautiously, trying to avoid the thorns, which seem to have evolved specifically to punish optimism. The berries are small, dark, and gleam with promise. You eat one. It bursts with tart sweetness, and for a moment the world is only that berry and your taste buds doing a little dance. You gather more. They won't last long, but you could dry a few, mash some into porridge, or mix them with honey if you're feeling fancy. You remember hearing that blackberry syrup was once used to treat sore throats. Or maybe it was blackberry wine that caused sore throats. It's all very circular. Further along, you spot hazelnuts, tiny greenish shells poking out from among the leaves. You crack one open with a stone, very high-tech, and nibble the soft kernel inside. It's buttery and subtle, a nice change from salted fish and barley mush. A squirrel watches you from a nearby branch with clear judgment. You bow slightly in apology. It's his territory, after all. You spot something weird under an old oak, a cluster of tiny plants with lemon-shaped leaves and a strong citrus scent. Wood sorrel. Tart, fresh, and good in small doses. You add it to the pile. Nearby you also find yarrow, used more for medicine than food, but hey, who among us hasn't added a medicinal plant to soup just to see what happens? By late morning, your basket is a rainbow of greens, berries, herbs, and roots, each with its own smell, texture, and culinary potential. You chew on a piece of wild mint, and suddenly even your medieval breath feels minty fresh. You wander further than you meant to, and find yourself at the edge of the bog. Ah yes, cranberries, the bog's own sour treasure. You reach in, pluck a few, and let them roll in your palm. They're sharp and intense, but in the right dish, they're divine. Foraging's not just about variety, it's about insurance. When your grain stores run low or your salted pork smells vaguely cursed, these wild additions keep your meals interesting and your nutrients mostly balanced. You pause to sip from your water skin and look around. The light has shifted, birds are chattering, and somewhere in the distance, someone is shouting about a goat getting into the cabbages again. The path home is slower. Your basket's heavier, and you're already dreaming up dishes. Maybe a pottage with wild garlic and chickweed, a berry mash to swirl into your morning porridge, mint tucked into your next jug of weak ale. Fancy. You remember your grandmother once foraged an entire feast, soup, salad, and even dessert made from honey-soaked nuts and crushed elderflowers. She also once made a soup so bitter it was declared a sin by the local priest. But hey, she was an artist. And here you are, walking home, the sun warming your back, your fingers stained with berry juice, your stomach growling with anticipation. Foraging may not be glamorous, but it's real, honest. A scavenger hunt where the prize is not dying of scurvy, and that's a pretty solid prize. You're barely in the door before someone shoves a jug into your hands and says, "Smell this." It's your neighbor, and from the look on her face, she's not entirely sure if what she's made is a drink or a biohazard. You cautiously uncork it and take a sniff. It's sweet, sour, a little yeasty, and definitely still fermenting. You nod solemnly. Smells like Thursday. Welcome to the bubbly, boozy, and occasionally exploding world of medieval fermentation. Mainstream historical fact. Fermented foods and drinks were everyday staples in medieval life, not just for flavor, but for preservation, nutrition, and water safety. Ale, mead, wine, sourdough, cheese, and pickled goods kept longer and often improved with age, sometimes. You set the jug aside and glance toward your own humble brewing corner. There, a large wooden vat bubbles quietly. This is your ale in progress. No hops, because those are still catching on in your part of the world, but it's flavored with groot, a medieval herbal mix that might include yarrow, mugwort, rosemary, or something your aunt swears is just mystery weed. You give the surface a stir. It hisses gently, like it's whispering medieval secrets. You're never entirely sure when it's done fermenting, but the last batch was so fizzy it popped the lid off and gave the dog a minor spiritual awakening. Quirky tidbit. Some brewers believed singing to their ale would help it ferment better. There's a ballad in your village specifically for cheering up the yeast. It rhymes poorly and involves clapping. On the other side of the hearth, you've got a clay pot full of sourdough starter, affectionately named the Beast. It's a blob of flour and water that's been collecting airborne yeasts and mysterious kitchen microbes for months. You feed it daily, whisper sweet nothings, and occasionally scold it when it bubbles too aggressively. Bread made with this starter is tangy, chewy, and likely contains more history than most textbooks. You ladle a bit of it into your mixing bowl, add some coarse flour, and knead it with practiced hands. The dough smells alive, and it is. You remember the time your cousin left his loaf too close to the hearth and it grew legs. Or maybe that was a rat. Hard to say. Historians still argue whether fermentation knowledge in medieval Europe was based more on scientific observation or sheer stubborn luck. What's certain is that people knew something was happening, even if they couldn't see the microscopic world behind the magic. Your neighbor returns clutching a clay pot. "Try the cheese," she says. It's her newest experiment. Curds strained in a linen sack, then packed in herbs and pressed with a rock. You cut a piece. It's firm, tangy, and slightly squeaky on the teeth. But honestly, not bad. You make your own cheese, too, sometimes from cow's milk, sometimes from sheep, depending on whose animal didn't run off that week. The process involves warming the milk, adding rennet, from a calf's stomach if you're being traditional, or from nettles if you're feeling vegetarian, and then letting it sit until it separates into curds and whey. The whey gets fed to pigs, and the curds get molded, pressed, and aged, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for hours, depending on how desperate dinner looks. A few shelves over, you've got crocks of sauerkraut bubbling away. You like to listen to them fizz when the house is quiet. The cabbage, salted and packed in its own juice, slowly turns sour and complex. It's good with sausage, great with boiled meat, and occasionally weaponized by prankster siblings who leave it under the bed. You also dabble in fruit fermentation. Your small pot of crabapple cider is coming along nicely, still sharp, but less likely to peel the lining off your throat than the last batch. Your friend down the road makes mead and trades it for cheese. Her bees are famously aggressive, but the honey is divine. Mead is simple in theory, just honey, water, and patience, but tricky in practice. Too warm and it dies. Too cold and it sulks. And if the yeast gets lazy, you just end up with sugary water and a bruised ego. Every household has its own technique, passed down in vague measurements like until it smells right or just before it screams. No one really knows what they're doing, but somehow it all mostly works. Even vinegar, technically wine that gave up on being pleasant, is cherished. You've got a jug with a thick mother floating inside, a slimy disc that looks horrifying, but turns wine to vinegar like a pro. You use it to pickle onions, rinse wounds, and occasionally threaten teenagers with. And let's not forget the drinks. In the absence of clean water, ale and small beer, low-alcohol brews, are daily staples. You drink them at breakfast, with lunch, and after dinner. They're not intoxicating unless you really try, but they're safer than the village well, which still smells suspiciously like goat. You even remember that one monk who claimed his holy order survived Lent on nothing but beer and prayer. You suspect he was stretching the truth or just very hydrated. Fermentation is more than just a method, it's a rhythm. You stir, strain, taste, wait. You adjust for the weather, the season, the mood of your ingredients. You never quite control the process. You guide it. Like raising children, or herding ducks, or negotiating with your mother-in-law. And sometimes fermentation goes wrong. The ale turns sour too soon. The bread collapses. The cheese grows a crusty halo and starts whispering in Latin. You scrape it off, start over, and pretend it didn't happen. But most of the time, these humble living foods fill your belly with warmth, and your home with scents that feel like security. They carry the past into the future, a bubbling link between generations who couldn't spell probiotic, but absolutely nailed the recipe anyway. By nightfall, your loaves are rising, the ale is burping in its vat, and your sourdough starter has calmed down after that mid-afternoon tantrum. You sip a mug of weak cider and smile. You may not know the science behind it, but you know the taste. You know the patience. You know the joy of turning time, air, and raw things into something magical. And honestly, if that's not alchemy, what is? The sun has barely blinked over the thatched rooftops when you grab a pair of shears and your coarsely woven gathering sack. It's market day, not just for buying and selling, but for gossiping, squabbling, and, most importantly, stocking up on things you can't forage, grow, or beg from your cousin's cellar. In a world without refrigeration, the medieval market is your rotating pantry, pharmacy, and entertainment center. You arrive just as the first stalls are unfolding. Wooden carts creak open to reveal bundles of dried herbs, baskets of eggs, some still warm, and barrels filled with suspiciously murky things that might be edible if you don't look directly at them. This, right here, is the lifeblood of your kitchen. Mainstream historical fact: weekly or seasonal markets were the backbone of local food supply in medieval Europe. Farmers, merchants, and householders relied on them to trade, barter, and purchase goods their own land couldn't provide. You head straight for the salt man. He's the grumpy type, with permanently stained fingers and a very specific opinion about how fine is too fine. Salt isn't just for flavor, it's for preserving everything from meat to fish to cheese. Without it, you're basically just watching your dinner rot in slow motion. You trade 2 skeins of hand-spun wool for a small block of rock salt. Fair deal, unless the wool had fleas again. Next, the fishmonger. His cart smells like brine and boldness, but that's expected. You scan his barrels: pickled herring, dried eels, and something that might have once been a sturgeon but now resembles jerky with a superiority complex. You grab a few salted sprats. They'll last for weeks if kept dry and wrapped in linen. Or at least they'll pretend to last that long until your youngest sneaks one, like it's candy. Quirky tidbit. Some vendors offered tastings, tiny slices of dried sausage or cheese cubes dusted in ashes, which, yes, was a thing. Other vendors shouted wildly exaggerated claims like, "This ham cured the Baron's gout," or "My butter will make your baby sleep through the night." A bold promise, considering babies back then rarely slept through anything. You pass the bread stall, admire the loaves baked with intricate stamps showing the baker's mark. Not just branding, but legal protection. If someone gets sick, you know who to blame. You smell honey cakes, sticky and dense, usually reserved for feast days, but hey, maybe today's a minor feast in your heart. Historians still argue whether food quality at medieval markets was generally high or hopelessly sketchy. Regulations existed, like standard bread weights and banned ingredients, but enforcement depended on whether the reeve was sober or bribed. You stop at the herb vendor. She's ancient, nearly part of the stall itself, with fingers like dried rosemary stems. Her table overflows with dried lavender, thyme, sage, and something she swears is dragon's blood, but smells suspiciously like paprika. You choose a sachet of marjoram and a bundle of mint, good for both meat dishes and making your breath less offensive to livestock. The cheese merchant offers hard wheels wrapped in waxy cloth and soft rounds buried in ash to slow spoilage. You pick one with a nutty aroma and trade a small bottle of vinegar for it. She needs it for pickling turnips. You need the cheese to not taste like feet. Further down, a butcher's stall boasts cuts of mutton, goat, and rabbit, hanging in the open air and attracting both customers and flies. Some cuts are rubbed in salt, others smoked and dangled above smoldering herbs. You know better than to buy raw meat this late in the morning, so you opt for a chunk of smoked lamb instead. It's leathery, but will soften nicely in a pottage. And oh, the dried goods cart. Lentils, broad beans, barley, peas, everything you need to bulk up a stew or make flat cakes that double as edible plates. You scoop out a few handfuls into your sack, feeling rich in the kind of way that only someone with legumes can understand. Across the way, a boy sells eggs, but you tap each one before choosing. One too many rotten surprises have taught you the delicate art of medieval egg roulette. You pick a dozen, wrap them in straw, and say a small prayer to St. Eustace, patron of not getting salmonella. You eye the wine cart, where a man pours cloudy red liquid into wooden cups. You pass this time. It's too early to walk home buzzed. And besides, last market day, you ended up trading half a sack of onions for what turned out to be beetroot wine, with attitude. At the edge of the square, an old couple sells preserved apples strung like garlands, dried pears as tough as leather, and plums soaked in honey and spices. You splurge a bit, handing over a precious beeswax candle for a small tin of sweet preserved quince. Before heading home, you visit the pottery woman. You're not here for food, but for the things food goes in. She's got clay pots lined with glaze, perfect for storing pickled cabbage or sour ale. You pick one the color of moss and promise to bring her more cloth scraps next week. By midday, your sack is a treasure chest of preserved, dried, salted, and smoked wonders. None of it needs a fridge, yet most of it will last until your next trip. That's the real genius of the market, not just the freshness, but the shelf stability. You load up your basket, feeling like a squirrel who just robbed a pantry. You pass the village crier, reading something about new barley taxes. Boo! But your thoughts are on dinner. Maybe a pottage thickened with lentils, topped with a slice of hard cheese. Dried apples rehydrated in wine for dessert. A dash of mint on everything to confuse your taste buds into thinking this is a feast. The walk home is heavy, but satisfying. You pass other villagers, their sacks bulging, their hands sticky from samples, their mouths full of opinions. The market is more than just a food supply. It's a community ritual, a place where news, flavors, and rumors are passed with equal urgency. Your door creaks open, and the house smells like last night's broth. You unpack your treasures, neatly stacking jars and bundling herbs. The salt goes in a dry pouch, the cheese into your cool cellar corner, the eggs into straw and prayer. No fridge, no freezer, no plastic wrap, just centuries of clever storage, cautious trade, and the will to make it work. And somehow it does. And now it's time to cook. The house is still, the fire a low whispering glow in the hearth, and outside the night yawns wide and quiet. You stretch your arms and glance around your kitchen. It's not the kind of kitchen modern chefs would recognize. No buzzing appliances, no stainless steel, no flickering fridge light. But it's lived in, worked in, trusted. Every shelf and hook holds something useful, something homemade, something that keeps the seasons at bay. Tonight's dinner is tucked into your belly, a slow-cooked pottage made from lentils, onions, and a bit of smoked mutton from the market. The broth was rich, made with a splash of leftover pickle brine and thickened with yesterday's bread crust. You topped it with chopped herbs and served it with a wedge of sour cheese and a slab of nutty brown bread from your own oven. But even as you rinse your wooden bowl, you're already thinking of tomorrow. Because in a world without refrigeration, food is never a passive convenience. It's an ongoing relationship. You don't just eat, you anticipate, you preserve, you adapt. Every leftover has a plan. Every scrap has a second life. Mainstream historical fact, most medieval households had to plan meals carefully around spoilage. This meant cooking small, manageable quantities, preserving in multiple ways, and transforming aging ingredients before they went to waste. Waste not, want not, wasn't a moral saying. It was survival. You wrap the last piece of bread in cloth, hang it from a hook to keep mice away. You pour the rest of the stew into a ceramic pot and set it near the hearth. It'll stay warm till morning, when it can become breakfast with a fresh egg cracked in. The cheese is covered and set in your coolest nook. You turn it just a bit to keep it aging evenly. You note that one corner is starting to go a bit soft. You'll eat that end first tomorrow. No panic, just part of the rhythm. You grind a few more herbs to top your dried apple slices. Tomorrow's lunch if your cousins don't sniff them out first. The pickled onions are still crisp, and you give one a taste. Sharp, salty, with that whisper of thyme you layered in weeks ago. They've only gotten better. Some households placed heavy stones or flat boards on top of food containers, not just to seal them, but to discourage mischievous spirits, or maybe just nosy toddlers. One never knows. A few old sausages dangle in the chimney, absorbing smoke and time. You check their firmness with a practiced poke. Good. Not too hard, not too greasy. They'll keep for another week at least. Your leftover ale is tucked into a corked jug. Not for long. Your neighbor's coming by tomorrow for a gossip session, and nothing lubricates scandal like a warm mug of half-fermented wheat juice. You reach for your tally board, where you've scratched a record of what's running low. Barley, vinegar, that root vegetable that nobody likes, but everyone eats anyway, because it's winterproof. You'll trade for some next market day. Maybe offer a jar of preserved quince, if you can resist eating it all first. Historians still argue whether medieval households practiced food rotation by intent or by sheer necessity. Was it strategy, or just the chaos of managing constant spoilage without modern controls? Either way, the system worked. Not perfectly, but it worked. You pause and listen. The wind outside hums through the shutters. A mouse scratches somewhere in the thatch. Your sourdough starter lets out a sleepy bubble from its crock. It's a quiet, edible ecosystem, where every living thing either contributes to dinner or tries to steal it. You close the herb cupboard, tap the lids of your storage jars like a silent good night. The dried peas, the beans, the onions hanging in a braid, all of them waiting, not frozen in time, but suspended, like soldiers on standby. You brush the table clean, chase off a hopeful spider, and let the fire dwindle. Your belly is full, your shelves are stocked, Your kitchen is loud with the kind of silence that means everything is in its place. Not just from chopping, baking, boiling, drying, pickling, brining, smoking, fermenting, and sealing, but from thinking 5 steps ahead. That's the thing about food in a world without refrigeration. You're always a little hungry for tomorrow, always solving for later. You climb into bed beneath a patchy wool blanket, feet still tingling from the stone floor. In the stillness, you imagine the tiny, slow transformations still happening in your kitchen, bread rising, vinegar forming, cheese ripening, like a moon behind the clouds. And somehow, that thought makes you feel safe. Let the hearth glow fade behind your eyelids now. Let the scent of bread crust and wood smoke soften into nothing. Your hands, rough from kneading and chopping, rest still beneath the covers, no longer needing to measure or stir or turn. You've fed yourself without ice, without glass doors humming in the night, without expiration dates printed in ink. You've made a life with salt, air, heat, and patience. And now even the wind outside has grown tired. The world shrinks to the creak of beams and the quiet breath of a house full of food that knows how to wait. There is nothing left to do, no lists, no fires to tend, no jars to check, only the rhythm of sleep. The stars outside glide slowly over your roof like cold lanterns, and you drift with them, carried softly on the breath of memory and old recipes. Maybe you'll dream of markets, or of a loaf rising beneath a cloth, or of your grandmother whispering how much time is too much time. Whatever it is, let it be slow, let it be warm, let it be wrapped in linen and tucked away for morning. You've done enough for today. Now exhale, and let everything still bubbling in the kitchen carry on without you for just a little while longer. Sweet dreams.